Chapter 748. Yu Youqian's cries not only shocked the pilgrims on Mount Longhu, but also the Taoist priests of Mount Longhu. They looked at Yu Youqian in shock, thinking that he was a lunatic. A young Taoist priest frowned and said, "Hey, are you crazy? Go to the Public Security Bureau to complain about your grievances. Why are you here?" When Yu Youqian was found by Wang Jinyuan, he was still working overtime at school, so he was naturally wearing ordinary clothes. After a busy night, he was not in the mood to change into a Taoist robe, so when he came he was still dressed like an ordinary person. Naturally, the Taoist priests of Mount Longhu would not think of him as a cultivator. When Yu Youqian heard the Taoist priest's words, he was immediately furious. He turned his head and shouted angrily, "I'm Yu Youqian from the Penglai sect. Where is Master Zhang? Where is Zhang Ling?" When the Taoist priest heard this, his heart skipped a beat. He immediately turned around and ran away. He knew that the person in front of him was a peer in the cultivation world and was not someone he could easily offend. Therefore he quickly reported the news to Zhang Ling, leaving Yu Youqian to be pointed at and whispered by the tourists and pilgrims. When Zhang Ling heard the news, she couldn't help but be stunned. She turned to look at her disciple, Zhou Ping. "Why is Yu Youqian here? Isn't he the Taoist companion of the leader of the Penglai sect? Why did he come to our Mount Longhu to complain?" Zhou Ping also said curiously, "I've never heard of such a cultivator before." Zhang Ling shook her head and said, "The Penglai sect is small, and leader Yu and her Taoist companion are very low-key. It's normal that you haven't heard of them. Hurry up and find Zhang Kongyun for me. I have a bad feeling that something must have happened." Zhou Ping responded, turned around and went out the door. Not long after, Zhang Kongyun arrived, accompanied by Zhang Lufang, who looked curious. After bowing to Zhang Ling with a smile, Zhang Lufang was ready to watch the show excitedly. When Zhang Ling saw that Zhang Kongyun had arrived, she motioned for Zhou Ping to bring Yu Youqian here. Zhou Ping nodded and turned to go out. About 10 minutes later, Yu Youqian entered the lobby with the urn. When Yu Youqian saw Zhang Ling and Zhang Kongyun, he immediately fell to his knees and shouted, "The Lady of the Earthly Fire, the Lady of Kongyun, you must uphold justice for me." The scene in front of them was really like a historical film where a wronged person stopped the sedan chair of an official and shouted, "Just and honorable lord, you have to seek justice for this commoner." The people in the room didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Even Zhang Ling, who had experienced many storms, couldn't help but feel a little amused at this time. She quickly said, "Jinrenyu, get up quickly. What's the matter? Get up and talk." Yu Youqian knelt on the ground and shook his head. "No, Lady of the Earthly Fire, promise me first that you will seek justice for me. Only then will I get up." Zhang Ling smiled bitterly and said, "Jinrenyu, how can I promise you if you don't tell me what it is?" Yu Youqian told them everything that had happened last night bit by bit. When he got to the sad part, tears and snot flowed down his face and he beat his chest and wailed. It was truly a heart-wrenching story. Even Zhang Lufang, who had wanted to watch the show, couldn't help but cry at the side. After Yu Youqian finished telling the whole story, he cried bitterly and said, "The Lady of the Earthly Fire, Jinren Kongyun. How could there be such a cruel witch in this world? Our Penglai sect has always been kind to others. We don't participate in the competition for fame and fortune, nor do we cause trouble. How could such a disaster have befallen us? If I hadn't run away quickly that night, I'm afraid that I would have been killed by that witch." Zhang Ling and Zhang Kongyun were stunned. Zhang Ling was stunned for a long time before she stammered, You mean Su Chan of the Fox Zen School killed the leader of your Penglai sect in Yumanlu? No, it can't be, right? Leader Yu's cultivation is not low. He shouldn't have lost to Su Chan. Even if he couldn't win, he should have been able to escape." Yu Youqian raised the urn in his hand and cried, "The ashes of my beloved wife and son are here. Their bodies and souls have been destroyed." Everyone in the room gasped. Zhang Kongyun tugged at his white beard and asked, "You just said that Wang Jinyuan, the leader of the Gizao sect, was also present at that time?" Yu Youqian nodded and said, "If it weren't for Master Wan, I'm afraid that this witch would have killed me on the spot." Zhang Kongyun became more and more confused. Master Wan's cultivation is very high. It's impossible for him to lose to Su Chan of the Fox Zen School. Yu Youqian smiled bitterly and said, "But it's impossible for you to not know who the person behind this witch is." The expressions of the people in the room immediately turned cold, and they all became solemn. A year ago, Li Yundong was a name that few people remembered except for his parents. But now, in the cultivation world of China and Japan, this name was really well known and everyone knew it. There was really a saying that if one didn't know Li Yundong, it would be useless to call himself a golden immortal. As soon as Yu Tian mentioned that Li Yundong was involved in this tragedy, Zhang Ling and Zhang Kongyun suddenly felt their hearts tighten and they looked at each other. Since the inauguration ceremony, Zhang Ling and Zhang Kongyun had talked about Li Yundong in private. Both of them had unanimously concluded that Li Yundong was the strongest and most promising young cultivator in more than 500 years from the late Ming dynasty to the modern era. His spiritual energy was terrifying, and his strength was unfathomable. His rise was unstoppable. Regardless of whether they liked or disliked Li Yundong, at least the Jingyi school could not afford to offend such a powerful character. What's more, the Jingyi school was in trouble both internally and externally. Not only had the inauguration ceremony been ruined by the Japanese, but the power of the Jingyi school had also plummeted. What was even more frightening was that the Xiantian sect had also taken advantage of the situation to force him to abdicate. The Jingyi school could barely take care of itself now. How could they have the leisure to uphold justice? What's more, Li Wudi was involved. Regardless of whether this matter was related to Li Wudi or not, even if it was related to him, would the Jingyi school start a war with Li Wudi for the Penglai sect, which they usually had no contact with? No way. Even a fool would know how to answer this multiple-choice question. Zhang Ling's mind was as fast as lightning. She asked, Jinrenyu, how do you know that Li Wudi is the mastermind? Yu Tian wiped away his tears. He was there that night. If he wasn't the mastermind, why did he go there? Zhang Kongyun frowned and said, but even if he was there, you can't be so sure that he is the mastermind. What kind of deep hatred does he have for your Penglai sect that he would do such a cruel thing? Yu Tian gritted his teeth and said, to tell you the truth, the unique skill of our Penglai sect, the secret method of patching heaven, has not been lost. I think Li Yundong came to snatch it. Moreover, I also found that the secret method of patching heaven had been stolen that night. They were the only ones who appeared that night. Who else could it be? This sentence was too powerful. Both Zhang Ling and Zhang Kongyun knew that even if this matter had nothing to do with Li Yundong and Su Chan were still the biggest suspects. At this time, Zhang Ling and Zhang Kongyun were cautious and didn't say anything. However, Zhang Lufang suddenly asked, Jinrenyu, how many people know that the secret method of patching heaven still exists in the world? Yu Tian was stunned for a moment. He knew that this news had been told to him by his wife. He didn't know who his wife had told. Yu Tian thought for a moment, gritted his teeth and said, no one knows. Zhang Lufang asked curiously, then how did Li Yundong and Su Chan know? It's so strange. Yu Tian suddenly raised his head and said angrily, do you mean that I'm lying? Zhang Lufang saw his ferocious look and was so scared that she took a step back. She immediately waved her hand and said, no, that's not what I meant. What I mean is, how did Li Yundong know that the secret method of patching heaven is still with you? Don't you think it's strange? Moreover, Li Yundong can do these things himself. Why did he ask Su Chan to do it? Wouldn't it be much more efficient for him to do it himself? Yu Tian and Wang Jinyuan had already discussed this before they came. Yu Tian laughed angrily and said, if he had recovered from his injuries at this time, do you think he wouldn't have wanted to do it himself? Jinren Zhang, what do you mean by saying good things about him? Do you think I would slander a good person? Zhang Liufang's expression changed and she said seriously, Jinrenyu, I don't mean to doubt you, but as far as I know, Jinren Li is not such a vicious and evil person. Moreover, he was very strict with his disciples at the Taoist assembly. I don't think Su Chan is such a villain. Why don't you calm down and find out the truth first? Yu Youqian's face turned pale. He turned to look at Zhang Ling and Zhang Kongyun and said, the lady of the earthly fire, Jinren Kongyun, do you think so too? Zhang Ling and Zhang Kongyun looked at each other. Zhang Kongyun lowered his head and remained silent. Zhang Ling sighed softly and comforted him, Jinrenyu, this matter is not a trivial matter. I think it's better to be cautious. Why don't you cultivate in Mount Longhu for a period of time? When we find out the truth of the matter, we can make a decision. What do you think? Yu Tian suddenly remembered what Wang Jinyuan had told him before. Jinrenyu, it's not that I want to pour cold water on you, but even if you go to the Jingyi school, they may not be willing to help you. Now that the Penglai sect has been destroyed, and the secret method of patching heaven has been taken away by others, what benefits can they get from avenging you? Offending Li Wudi for the sake of a sect that was already in ruins? Do you think they would be so stupid? You have to be careful of being betrayed by others with honeyed words and hidden daggers. Thinking of this, Yu Tian immediately became extremely vigilant. He held the urn tightly in his arms, stood up quickly and kept retreating. What do you want to do? Detain me here, inform Li Yundong of the news and then kill me to keep me quiet? Everyone in the room was speechless. They hadn't expected that Yu Tian would be so paranoid as to think of them as accomplices, but they couldn't understand why an ordinary person like Yu Tian would suddenly have a beautiful and happy family destroyed in an instant. His mind had become extremely paranoid, almost to the point of being demonic. He had already determined that Li Yundong and Su Chan were the murderers. Anyone who doubted this was an accomplice. When Yu Tian saw that everyone in the room was smiling bitterly, he became more and more certain of his judgment. Suddenly he ran out quickly. As he ran he shouted, "Murder! The Jingyi school is going to kill me to keep me quiet." Zhou Ping was furious when she heard this. She subconsciously wanted to chase after him. ***, how dare you slander me? However, Zhang Ling grabbed her, shook her head and sighed. This Xinrenyu is not far from madness. He is already miserable enough. Forget it, let him go. Zhou Ping frowned and said, "Master, do you believe his words?" Zhang Ling pondered for a while, then asked instead of answering, "Pinger, do you believe his words?" Zhou Ping was stunned for a moment. The figure who had once blocked the 6 great sects in Mount Tianlong, snatched food from the tiger's mouth in Mount Gizhou, laughed and cursed at the Taoist assembly, and fought against the Japanese cultivation world alone at the inauguration ceremony had suddenly jumped out. No matter how much she disliked Li Yundong, she couldn't deny the fact that Li Yundong was an indomitable man. How could such a man do such a cruel thing? After thinking for a while, Zhou Ping said flatly, "I believe that the tragedy that happened to him is true, but if Su Chan is the murderer and Li Yundong is the mastermind, this is too unbelievable. I don't believe it." Zhang Lufeng, who was standing to one side, suddenly asked curiously, "Eldest Shiji, haven't you always hated the Fox Zen school and Li Yundong?" Zhou Ping said seriously, "Yes, I do hate them. But even though I hate them, I really can't imagine that Li Yundong is such a person. As for Su Chan, I don't think she has the ability or the guts to do such a thing. The Fox Zen school has always been the target of public criticism. Why would she do such a heinous thing at this critical juncture and cause trouble for herself? The whole thing seems reasonable and well-founded, but if you look at it carefully there are many flaws." At this time, Zhang Ling suddenly pondered for a while and said, "Do you think that Li Yundong and the others went to snatch the secret method of heaven patching for Ziyuan to repair the powerful magical weapon?" Zhang Kongyun and Zhang Lufeng were stunned and blurted out, "It's very possible." However, Zhou Ping shook her head and said, "That's even more problematic. Given Ziyuan's character, she would definitely have gone with Li Yundong. If she had been there at that time and Li Yundong had done such a thing, do you think Yu Tian would have had a chance to come to our Mount Longhu?" For a moment, Zhang Ling and the others were all silent. They knew Ziyuan's ability very well. Even if Wang Jinyuan was there, he might not be Ziyuan's match. They could kill Yu Tian on the spot and the whole thing would be buried in the sea. There would be no truth. Zhang Kongyun let out a long sigh and said, "The affairs of the world are really confusing. I don't know which person behind the scenes did such a heinous thing. I always feel that this is just the beginning." Zhang Ling thought for a moment and said, "What you said makes sense. However, no matter what, this matter is very strange. We can't be easily involved in it. Otherwise the cultivation world will be in chaos. The Japanese have just left, and the Xintian sect wants to take advantage of the situation. We should consider shrinking our defenses first." Just as the Jingyi school decided to stay out of trouble and Yu Tian left in disappointment, Li Yundong and the others received a reasonable and unexpected piece of good news at home. Chapter 749. At noon the next day after the murder of the Penglai sect, Li Yundong cautiously chose not to go out. When he returned to his room he found that most of his physical injuries had recovered, thanks to the strong 5 internal organs that had been transformed by the Renyuan Jindan and the Diyuan Jindan. In the battle with Sayonji Tsunekatsu, the most important thing for Li Yundong was that his meridians and qi and blood were seriously damaged, but his 5 internal organs were not injured. This was equivalent to a fierce battle on the border between the two countries. His foundation was not hurt, so his recovery was particularly fast. Thinking of what had happened last night, Li Yundong couldn't help but feel a little scared. If the other party had come for him, if the other party wanted to kill him, then last night would have been the best opportunity. His cultivation had been greatly reduced, but he had been running around with the body of Yang spirit. It was really audacious. Thinking about this, Li Yundong didn't dare to run around for a while. He made up his mind to stay by his body and wait for his injury to heal. Once his injury was healed, his body would return to being a leakless body. At that time he would have the power of Jinshin again. With the power of Jinshin in hand, who would be afraid of in the world? But at this time Feng Na called Li Yundong's cell phone. "What? The Japanese are here again? Li Yundong said in surprise after hearing the news from Feng Na. Feng Na said with joy and worry, yes, this time there are more people than last time. Li Yundong temporarily put aside the heavy heart brought about by the Penglai sect case and smiled slightly. Isn't that good? The business in the shop is getting better and better. I should congratulate you. Feng Na said worriedly, what's good about it? Last time all the tea in the shop was drunk. I only had time to buy a little. Now it's only enough for these people to drink a cup of tea. Li Yundong said with a smile, you can go to other tea shops and buy some ready-made tea. Anyway, you won't lose money. Feng Na sighed. I went there yesterday and bought all the tea I could buy nearby, but they still drank it all. These Japanese really don't seem to be drinking tea, it seems like they are drinking wine. Aren't the Japanese very particular about tea art? Why do they all drink tea so fiercely? Li Yundong smiled and said, do you think everyone in Japan is like this? This was Yamaguchi-gumi, a mafia. Do you expect these people who fight and kill all day to quietly appreciate the tea ceremony? You think too highly of them. By the way, these guys didn't cause any trouble, right? Only then did Feng Na smile. No, they're just a little unhappy that they can't see you. But they're still very devout in the shop. I heard that the underworld people in our country worship Guan Yu. Why do you think the Japanese underworld people worship the immovable Wisdom King? In the future, our store will become the immovable Wisdom King shrine worshipped by the Japanese? Can I consider selling some incense and candles to make some money? Li Yundong smiled and said, that's a good idea. Just set a higher price. Those who want to burn incense will definitely come. It would be a waste not to take advantage of these Japanese. However, Feng Na hesitated and said, but will they not come again? Li Yundong couldn't help laughing. Do you still want to make money off me for the rest of my life? Do you think he will always come here? Was he really a moron? I just need to make a few bucks. Hearing Li Yundong's words, Feng Na immediately thought it through and said happily, well, I know what to do. Li Yundong knew that after Feng Na hung up the phone with a smile, the Japanese people would cry. It would be strange if they didn't cry for their parents. These Japanese people won't come again after being slaughtered a few times, will they? It's not a good thing that Desanxian always comes to Yamaguchi-gumi. Li Yundong thought to himself. He couldn't help but think of the scene in which the Desanxian was full of black-clothed people. A good person came downstairs and wanted to have a serious drink of tea, but all the black-clothed people looked at the door with murderous eyes, which immediately scared the common people and made them flee. If it really becomes like this, then Desanxian should change its name to Desanxian. The shop is black-clothed and the price is black-clothed. It didn't fail to live up to the name of Black Shop, Li Yundong thought self-deprecatingly. However, he did not expect that the Japanese would be extorted even more ruthlessly by Feng Na this time. Many members of Yamaguchi-gumi did not even get to drink tea. Instead, they drank plain water and happily handed over a lot of money. Feng Na's hands were weak and her heart was guilty. She even suspected that after these Japanese people paid the money with a smile, they would turn around and kill her, the black-hearted businessman, with a knife. However, after waiting for a few days in fear, what she was worried about did not happen. On the contrary, Japanese people poured into the Desanxian shop in an endless stream. Almost every day there were Japanese people coming, and there were at least 10 people a day. And as time went by, the number of Japanese tourists gradually increased, and they were no longer all Yamaguchi-gumi people. What surprised and puzzled Feng Na was that these mountain pass people and ordinary tourists did not have anything to do with each other. Basically, they drank their own tea and burned their own incense. They were clearly separated from each other and minded their own business. They did not look at each other too much. Although the business of the Desanxian shop had improved by leaps and bounds, Feng Na still felt that the situation in front of her was a little funny. Almost all the people who came to the tea shop in China were Japanese, and there were only a few Chinese people. It was really strange. But what Feng Na did not know was that in Japan, the tea ceremony was an elegant and noble thing. On the one hand, these Yamaguchi-gumi people could attach themselves to the elegance, and on the other hand they could take the opportunity to worship the Buddhist mafia boss Akalanatha. One had to know that there were times when King Kong was angry, and there were times when the Buddha roared like a lion. However, when the Buddha was angry he couldn't possibly go into the arena to PK with his bare arms. That would be too embarrassing. Even if he encountered the great sage equaling heaven who refused to submit to heaven and earth, the Buddha would only exchange a few blows with him in a friendly manner. However, Buddha would always encounter powerful demons. At this time he needed someone to help him deal with these enemies. At this time the 5 wisdom kings came into being, and the Akalanatha was the incarnation of Buddha's anger. He had the functions of killing people and robbing people, silencing people and arson people. There was no one in the world that he could not defeat. Wasn't such a character the object of every gangster's fantasy? Moreover, Japan was the only country in the world that recognized the legalization of mafia. The reason for this recognition was very simple, because the power of mafia had penetrated into every level of Japan. The whole politics of Japan was a living combination of mafia politics and black money politics. If they wanted to eradicate the power of mafia, the whole politics of Japan would immediately collapse. Therefore, in order to protect themselves and whitewash themselves, the Japanese politicians made the law to legalize the power of mafia. When all the people did not see the mafia as a mafia, the politics secretly controlled by the mafia was naturally not a mafia politics. It was also because of this reason that the Japanese Yakuza parade, which was supported by the law, was a unique scene on the streets of Japan. It was rare for a Chinese like Feng Na to see so many Yakuza members swaggering through the streets, but the Japanese were used to it. Moreover, these ordinary Japanese tourists also knew that as long as they didn't look at these Yakuza members, they wouldn't get into trouble. These ordinary Japanese tourists were also devout believers of Buddhism. After hearing the news from the Japanese cultivation world, many people came to China to worship the living immovable wisdom king out of curiosity. Although they did not see Li Yundong in person, they saw many mafia members of Yamaguchi-gumi also here to worship and drink tea, which strengthened their views. Therefore they went back and spread the news. The tea shop opened by the reincarnated Wisdom King was a mess in China, but it quickly became famous in Japan. This could be considered as planting flowers in the wall, the fragrance outside the wall. The east side was not bright, but the west side was bright. Just as the business of Desangxian tea shop was booming, Yu Tian, who had been asking for justice everywhere, was once again rejected by the Chuanjian Dragon sect. Yu Tian originally thought that the Chuanjian Dragon sect had always boasted of being a righteous sect and would help him uphold justice. However, he rarely asked about the affairs of the cultivation world. He did not know that the sect that had the best personal relationship with Li Yundong in the cultivation world was the Chuanjian Dragon sect. After seeing Yu Tian off, Du Fei, who was thinking in the spacious and bright office, suddenly raised his head and looked at Yu Sheng and Wei Qing beside him with a puzzled expression. "Do you believe Yu Yotian's words?" Wei Qing and Yu Sheng looked at each other. Wei Qing said first, "I believe half of it, but I don't believe half of it." Du Fei asked, "What do you mean?" Wei Qing said very seriously, "I believe that what happened to Jinren Yu is true, but I don't believe that Li Yundong would instruct Su Chan to do such a thing." At this time Yu Sheng also nodded and said firmly, "Jinren Li is definitely not such a person. I fought with him before. Jinren Li has always been above board in fights and has never won by tricks or conspiracies. Moreover, his Jinchi is majestic and righteous. He is definitely not such a despicable person. If he were such a despicable person, it would be impossible for him to have such Howren Jinchi. As the saying goes, one's appearance comes from one's heart. In the cultivation world, there was also a saying that people's hearts were revealed in fights. Although this saying was not necessarily absolutely correct, it was quite reasonable. Although Du Fei didn't agree with Yu Sheng's reasoning, he agreed with Yu Sheng's final opinion. Du Fei nodded and said, "I also don't think Jinren Li is such a person, but this matter happened so suddenly. Jinren Yu doesn't seem to be a person who will give up easily. If he makes such a big fuss about it, I'm afraid it will be very disadvantageous to Jinren Li in the future." As he spoke, Du Fei suddenly stood up and said decisively, "No, I have to see Li Yundong immediately and tell him about this." Yu Sheng didn't have much of a reaction when he heard this, but Wei Qing, who was next to him, became excited. Her eyes were shining. Okay, I want to go too. I've been busy all day today and my head is swollen. It's raining all the time and the air is so humid that I want to die. I feel uncomfortable all over. Asterisk. Chapter 750. Please remember the domain name of this site. Or search on Baidu Sanlian Literature website. When Du Fei arrived at Li Yundong's house with Wei Qing, almost all the little foxes in Li Yundong's house had gone to help in the Desangxian store. Even Chao Yi and Lu Yuehong had gone with them. Only Su Chan and Li Yundong were left in the big house. Zhou Qin, Zi Yuan, and the others were cultivating quietly in the house opposite. Li Yundong was very surprised to see Du Fei's visit, but he soon smiled and said, "Jinren Du, how have you been? Are you here to urge me to return the burning thumb pot?" After Li Yundong borrowed the burning thumb pot from Du Fei, he had kept it with him. It was a bit like Liu Bei borrowed Jingzhou and never returned it. However, he really couldn't leave this powerful magical weapon and was reluctant to return it to Du Fei. At this time, seeing Du Fei come to his door, he felt sorry for him, so he simply said it first to avoid the awkward atmosphere when Du Fei asked for it. Du Fei laughed, saluted with one hand and said, "Jinren, you must be joking. This Buddhist powerful magical weapon is like a pearl covered with dust in my hands, but it shines in your hands." The battle between Mount Longhu and Takahashi Shoto was really satisfying. If such a powerful magical weapon was in my hands, I'm afraid we could only watch Takahashi Shoto escape back to Japan. At this time, Wei Qing was the first to respond. She said with a smile, "That's right. If a murderous devil like Takahashi Shoto could become a Buddha immediately, it would be too annoying. Fortunately, you are powerful. Otherwise, it would be a great shame for our Chinese cultivation world." Li Yundong laughed and said, "Don't mention it. Jinren is broad-minded and let me use this powerful magical weapon to do whatever I want." While they were talking, Li Yundong had already welcomed them into the living room and turned to ask Su Chan to make tea for them. Du Fei glanced at Su Chan with flickering eyes, then sat down on the sofa and suddenly asked, "Jinren, do you know why I suddenly came to visit?" Li Yundong smiled and said, "If it wasn't for the burning thumb pot, I really wouldn't know." Du Fei said with a serious face, "Jinren, do you know Yu Tian?" Li Yundong's expression suddenly changed, and the smile on his face slowly disappeared. He said in a low voice, "I know. How do you know him?" Du Fei stared at Li Yunyang and slowly told him about how Yu Tian had found him. He said, "According to my speculation, Yu Tian must have found the Jingyi school first, and then came to our Chuanjin sect. However, leader has been in closed-door training recently. He couldn't find anyone so he came to me." There was a faint smile at the corner of Li Yundong's mouth. "Jinren, do you believe that I did this?" As he spoke, he glanced at Su Chan who was biting her lip. "Or do you believe that she did it?" Du Fei smiled slightly. "Jinren, if I believed that you did it, I wouldn't have come here today." Li Yundong asked, "Then why did Jinren come?" Du Fei smiled and said, "I want to hear you tell me in person that you are not a murderer, Jinren." Li Yundong immediately asked, "That's it? Do you believe me just because I say it?" Du Fei smiled and said, "Jinren is a modest gentleman. Of course I believe what you say." Li Yundong stared at Du Fei for a long time, then slowly revealed a sincere smile. "Jinren, I didn't do this nor did Su Chan. We were framed." As he spoke, Li Yundong told the whole story from beginning to end and sighed. "But the whole thing has a lot to do with me. I will definitely find the murderer behind the scenes. First, I will give leader you an explanation. Second, I will prove Su Chan and me innocent." At this time Wei Qing, who had not had a chance to interrupt, suddenly said very seriously, "Jinren, I believe in you. You will definitely find the real murderer." Li Yundong laughed. "Jinren, you really have confidence in me? I don't even have confidence in myself." The people in the room all laughed. Su Chan's heart was heavy, and her smile was a little forced. At this time Du Fei said with a smile, "Jinren, you have to be careful these days. I think Jinren has reached a dead end. He insists that you are the murderer and is now running around. Although I believe that no one from the sects will stand up for him, Jinren, you have to be careful. If anything is repeated too many times, the lie will become the truth. If someone uses this matter to make things difficult for you, the consequences will be unimaginable. You have to be on guard." Li Yundong nodded and said, "Jinren, you are right. I am prepared. Please rest assured." Du Fei laughed and said, "Jinren, I am relieved to hear that. You are now the pillar of the Chinese cultivation world, the stabilizing force. Don't let the Japanese not defeat you, but you fall because of the conspiracy of your own people." Li Yundong smiled and said, "The reason why a conspiracy is called a conspiracy is that it can't see the light of day. It's like snow in winter that melts when it sees the sun. I believe that in this world, conspiracies can't compete with justice. I believe that justice exists in people's hearts just like you, Jinren and Jinren chose to believe me." Du Fei was relieved. After chatting with Li Yundong and the others for a while, he chose to leave. In the next few days, Li Yundong guarded his body tightly, and his yang spirit did not wander around. He did not go out of the door, nor did he take a step. 6 days later, early in the morning, the little foxes who had prepared to go to the Desangxian tea shop to help, were busy grooming themselves. These days the business of the Desangxian was booming. People from the Yamaguchi-gumi came one after another. These Yamaguchi-gumi aroused the interest of ordinary Japanese tourists, and these ordinary Japanese tourists aroused the interest of Chinese tourists. Chinese people like to join in the fun, follow the trend and be cultured. When many people saw these Japanese people rushing toward the Desanxian tea shop, even the most indifferent people couldn't help but have a big question mark in their hearts. What on earth are these Japanese people going to do? As the saying goes, curiosity killed the cat. Slowly, some Chinese people who dared to try went upstairs to drink tea. It was hard to say whether they could taste the tea or not, but every waiter in the Desanxian tea shop was a beautiful little fox. Even the lobby manager and the assistant were pretty girls. Even if they didn't drink tea, it was still a pleasant thing to look at beautiful women here. Moreover, the appearance of so many Yamaguchi-gumi in these places was something that could only be seen in movies. Therefore, many tea guests also went to watch the fun. They pointed at the Yamaguchi-gumi in the tea house and talked about it. It seemed that it was very cool to criticize these world-famous Yamaguchi-gumi members like this. And the truth was that if ordinary people in Japan dared to point at the Yamaguchi-gumi like this, they would be miserable. The Yamaguchi-gumi would definitely rush up and beat them up as soon as possible. Not to mention pointing at them, even looking at them would cause a bloody disaster. But these Yamaguchi people also knew that this was China's territory, it was the Akalanatha's tea house. Even if there were people pointing at them, they turned a blind eye, as if they did not hear anything, they behaved as if they were good students. The Chinese tea guests wished they could give each of them a certificate of merit. In the past, the business of Desanxian had been too quiet, and the beauties in the shop were too beautiful. Therefore, the impression it gave people was that the shop must be very shady and the price must be very high, so no one dared to go there. However, when the Desanxian really became a veritable black shop, and its business was as busy as a market, no one thought so. On the contrary, people rushed to join in the fun and rushed to the Desanxian to taste tea, look at the beauties and look at the Japanese Yamaguchi. Although the price was ridiculously high, the mentality of the tea guests changed from no one dared to go there to this shop's business is so good, and so many Japanese have come from afar. There must be a reason for the high price. Moreover, the decoration of this shop, as well as the appearance and quality of the waiters, even a 7-star hotel does not have such stunning waiters. It's normal that it's expensive. Only when it's expensive can it show its style, and only when it's expensive can it show its grade. If the price is low, I won't go there. It had to be said that the polarized business situation of Desanxian had surprised Feng Na and Cheng Cheng. At night, they counted the money until their hands were cramping and they had to sigh. These people are so despicable. They don't come when the price is low, but when the price is high they praise it. The consumer psychology of the Chinese people is really difficult to understand. But no matter what, Desanxian had become popular, at least in Japan and Tianan City. In Japan there was even a special website for Desanxian, introducing every detail of the tea shop opened by the reincarnated immovable wisdom king. There was a detailed introduction of every pillar and every teacup. At first, most of the people who logged on were the low-level Yamaguchi-gumi who had nothing to do. This group of low-level gangsters had nothing to do all day when they were not fighting or collecting protection fees. They were so idle that they would pick out lice in their crotches and pluck hair from their crotches. When they heard that there was such a website, they immediately swarmed over. But this group of people also had their own families, and their families also had their own friends. Japan was a religious country with nearly 100 million Buddhists, and Immovable Wisdom King was the god that all Buddhists believed in. With such a deep mass base, the popularity and traffic of this website rose steadily, and it quickly became popular like a rocket. Especially when the Yamaguchi-gumi revealed that Li Yundong had defeated the 3 giants of Japanese Buddhism by himself, these tourists who logged on to the website of Desanxian were all speechless for a while, and then they frantically inquired about the authenticity of this matter in shock. The official websites of Pure Land True Sect, Xinyan Tantrism, and Tiantai Sect were flooded with all kinds of saliva and questions. The enmity between Pure Land True Sect and Tiantai Sect with Li Yundong was too great, so the 2 giants unanimously remained silent. Kaisai Hikaryuni of Xinyan Tantrism seemed to be much smarter. Not only did he talk about the fight, but he also praised Li Yundong and praised him highly. Because he knew that only by creating an opponent that made the Japanese believers feel invincible and invincible could they be forgiven for their defeat. At this time, Ise Xingguang of Ise Shinto also stood up to speak, praising Li Yundong as the unique great cultivator in the Chinese cultivation world in recent years. His cultivation was profound, his magical power was amazing, and he was invincible in fighting. Even in the Chinese cultivation world, he had a nickname. Invincible Li. Japanese people had a strong slave mentality. When you were weaker than him, he would definitely bully you. When you were about the same as him, he would definitely compete with you. But when you were stronger than him, he would shout sourly. But when you were much stronger than him, he would worship you respectfully. Se Shinto had a deep influence in Japan, and at this time the ape family also stood up to prove this point. At this time all the doubts disappeared, replaced by one-sided praise and flattery. Especially when the busybody found out the details of Li Yundong, all the curious believers were stunned for a moment. What? Such a great cultivator with profound cultivation, amazing magical power, and invincible in fighting was not an old man in his 70s or 80s, but a great cultivator who was only 20 years old. And he was so handsome? Was there any justice in this world? Was there any humanity left? The female believers went crazy after seeing the photos of Li Yundong that had been circulated. Overnight, Li Yundong had gained many fanatical fans in distant Japan. If it weren't for the distance, there would have been many fanatical admirers at the door of his house. It had to be said that no one had expected that the Battle of Mount Longhu would lead to such a result. This really surprised everyone, especially Kaisai Hikaryuni, Ise Xingguang, and Abe Yuri who had participated in the campaign. They hadn't expected that the enthusiasm of the people would be so exaggerated. Ise Chuyun commented on these crazy believers sarcastically, "If Li Yundong opens a Desanxian tea shop in Kyoto, I'm afraid that the shop will be torn down by these believers the next day. They will take every piece of wood and brick of the shop and take it back to keep it as a family heirloom." Under such circumstances, the future of Desanxian was obvious. The little foxes were so busy every day that their backs ached. They had been too idle before, but now they were so busy that they didn't even have time to watch soap operas. But no matter what, good business always made people happy. But what made the little foxes a little unhappy was that their leader had gone into seclusion again. When the Desanxian tea shop needed him the most, he chose to go into seclusion again. But today, when the little foxes finished washing up and were about to go to Desanxian to report, Ling Yu saw a person coming out of Li Yundong's room. Ling Yu's eyes lit up and she said in surprise, "Leader, you've come out of seclusion?" As she spoke, she suddenly stopped in place and looked at Li Yundong with her mouth agape. For a moment she couldn't say anything. At this time, the little foxes also looked at Li Yundong in unison. They saw that the leader, whom they were so familiar with, seemed to have been reborn again, and his appearance and figure had changed a lot. Oh, this is the second update to make up for yesterday's update. I'm sorry I was too tired and my head was throbbing. I could only wait until I woke up this morning to make up for it in the future. If you guys still haven't updated after 12 o'clock, then don't wait anymore. There is a limit to one's strength. To quickly find this site, please search on Baidu Sanlian Literature website. Chapter 751. When a cultivator's yang spirit was cultivated to its peak state, the Jinshin was the most precious. Even after transcending the thunder tribulation and becoming a golden immortal, their yang spirit body would still become a Jinshin. Could be said that the highest level of the yang spirit was the Jinshin. The reason why it was called the Jinshin was that the Taoist cultivators borrowed the name from the Buddhist classics. It meant that gold was precious and rare, and gold could be forged at will and changed into any shape. The yang spirit of a cultivator could be ever-changing, but it was absolutely impossible for the body to change at will. Even if a cultivator practiced hard and used the powerful power of his internal organs to instantly transform the body in a short period of time, it was only a change on the original foundation of the body. It could not be as ever-changing as the yang spirit. The physical body was the furnace to bear the spiritual power of the cultivators. Without a good furnace, no matter how high one's cultivation level or how deep one's spiritual power was, it would be useless. Therefore, the Taoist cultivators attached great importance to the cultivation of the physical body. Their highest requirement for the physical body was not measured by gold, but by jade. Jade was the beauty of a stone. It had 5 virtues. It was moist and gentle. It could be said to be a flawless stone. It was rare and precious, gentle and euphemistic. Jade was often used together with gold. This could be seen from the long-standing idioms or proverbs, such as golden rules and jade rules, golden advice, and one has eyes but fails to recognize the golden inlaid jade. Therefore, cultivators used jade to measure their own furnace bodies, which also meant that they regarded the two as equally important, of the same status, and kept abreast of each other. When a Taoist cultivator achieved the Great Way, his physical body was often measured by the realm of jade. At this time, Li Yundong's change had begun to transform into the realm of jade. In the past, Li Yundong's skin was as delicate and white as a woman's, but at this time, when the little foxes looked at him, they saw that Li Yundong's skin was so delicate that almost no pores could be seen. His whole body seemed to be carved out of jade, and there was a faint layer of gentle light on his skin. Ling Yu was shocked and thought that Li Yundong was still walking outside with his yang spirit. With the ability of the yang spirit to change constantly, it was naturally not surprising that he could change like this. But when Ling Yu got close to Li Yundong, she widened her eyes and looked at him carefully for a while. Then she rushed to the room behind Li Yundong and took a look. Only then did she find that Li Yundong had recovered from his injuries and was walking in his body. Ling Yu held her face with both hands and exclaimed, "Sect Master, your cauldron body has been cultivated to the jade body realm?" This shout startled the little foxes and they gathered together. They looked at Li Yundong with envy in their eyes. The bolder ones went forward to touch him, poke him, and then ran away with a smile. In the past, in their eyes, although Li Yundong's personality was easygoing, he always exuded an aggressive heroic spirit. Even after he had cultivated to the Jinshin phase, his cultivation had begun to move towards the realm of returning to nature, and his heroic spirit had begun to slowly restrain. There was always a heroic spirit unique to young people between his eyebrows. But now, all the edges between Li Yundong's eyebrows had disappeared. His sword-like eyebrows had become straight, and the sharp edges at the tip of his eyebrows had become gentle and obtuse, as if someone had specially trimmed them. His facial features also seemed to be covered with a layer of faint crystal luster, which made people feel comfortable at first glance. There was no aggressive aura at all. Especially when Li Yundong looked at them at this time, his eyes were deep and gentle. They were both deep and broad, but also crystal clear and gentle. At this moment, a phrase came to all of their minds at the same time. "A gentleman is like a jade." Li Yundong laughed and patted their heads. He hadn't expected that after this serious injury, the heavenly Jindan technique in his body would once again play a role in changing blood, bones and internal organs, shaping his body cauldron to a whole new realm. In the eyes of ordinary people, Li Yundong had only become more handsome, and his temperament had become more elegant and mature. But in the eyes of a discerning cultivator, Li Yundong's fighting strength had once again reached a higher level because of the growth of his cauldron body. The reason why cultivators had magical power was that they could activate the essence, qi and blood in their bodies. By doing so they could produce a powerful energy. However, people were born with loopholes. The 7 orifices, pores and other places were all big loopholes in the human body. When cultivators activated their essence, qi and blood, the yuanqi of the human body would involuntarily leak out through these loopholes. This principle was like a pressure cooker. If there were more air holes, the air pressure inside would naturally be lower, and it would be more impossible for the things inside to be cooked or compressed into smaller things. The reason why cultivators could compress all the jinqi in their bodies into Niden was that they had a leakless body without any flaws. The fewer the holes in their bodies, the greater the compression power, and the greater the power of Niden. In the past, Li Yundong's skin was delicate and his pores were naturally small, so he could get twice the result with half the effort when cultivating. When he closed his pores and activated his jinqi because his pores were naturally small, he didn't need to spend more energy on closing his pores, so the power that burst out was particularly strong. But at this time, Li Yundong's pores had become even smaller. Not even a single hair could be seen on his skin. Only when looking carefully could one see a trace of extremely thin fluff on his skin, like that of a baby. In this way, when Li Yundong closed his pores, he could even use up almost no jinqi and he could use more jinqi for fighting. In ancient times, the most commonly used words to describe Taoist cultivators, apart from being sage-like, were a crane with a child's face. The reason why it was called a child's face referred to the fact that the skin of cultivators was getting more and more delicate, and their pores were getting smaller and smaller, just like that of a child. Li Yundong was like this now. At the young age of 20 years old, he had cultivated his yang spirit and body to the Jinshin and Jadeshin realms at the same time. This was really shocking and the little foxes couldn't help but be amazed. Li Yundong smiled and drove away the little foxes who had come over to take advantage of him. He smiled at Ling Yu and asked, "Where's Su Chan?" Ling Yu pointed to Su Chan's room and said, "Su Chan has also been cultivating in seclusion these days. I've never seen her work so hard." For various reasons, Li Yundong and the others did not tell the other people of the Fox Zen school about the Penglai sect. Su Chan had taken the blame, so her mind was heavy and she was unhappy all day long. She hid in her room and cultivated alone. Although her behavior was abnormal, the little foxes all thought that she was unhappy because their master had left without saying goodbye, so they didn't think anything else. Although De Sanxian was so busy that everyone had their feet in the air, and even Zhou Qin had to go over to help from time to time, the little foxes were still very considerate and didn't let Su Chan go over to help. It could be regarded as a lucky hit, so they let her hide at home alone to avoid trouble. Li Yundong looked in the direction of Ling Yu's finger and couldn't help smiling. "It's okay. Let her cultivate well. This girl used to be too playful. It's not too late to mend the pen after the sheep is lost. Ling Yu giggled and was about to speak when the little foxes who were already ready to leave at the door shouted and urged, "Shiji Ling Yu, let's go. We're going out." Only then did Ling Yu turn around and wave to Li Yundong. "Leader, I'll go first." Li Yundong looked at the little foxes standing at the door in groups, grinning and ready to go to work. For a moment he felt very emotional. When he had taken these lawless little foxes down the mountain in Mount Tianlong, who would have known that this day would come? Li Yundong watched with a smile as the little foxes were about to leave at the door, but suddenly they all stopped and looked at the stairwell strangely. One after another they made way for him. After a while, a tall girl with blonde hair and blue eyes appeared at the door. It was Chris. Li Yundong asked curiously, "Chris? You're back? Has the crew finished filming?" Chris's face was covered with dust. She looked at the little foxes in surprise and asked curiously, "Where are they going?" Li Yundong smiled and said, "They went to the store to help." Chris laughed. "Is the business in the store getting better and better?" Li Yundong cupped his hands and said with a smile, "Thanks to you, it's really good." Chris pursed her lips and smiled. "That's good. You don't have to throw me out to film in the future. I'm so tired that my bones are about to fall apart." Li Yundong smiled and said, "Don't worry, it's just this once. There won't be a next time." Chris smiled reservedly and said, "I hope so." As she spoke, she suddenly looked at Li Yundong suspiciously and asked curiously, "Master, why do I feel like you've become a different person? Oh my God, your skin is too fine, isn't it? If other girls see your skin like this, they will gnash their teeth with jealousy." Chris's eyes almost popped out of their sockets. Her eyes were filled with envy, and she wished she could replace Li Yundong's skin with hers. After a long time, Ling Yu, who had returned, pushed the door open again. Chris came to her senses and looked at the door with Li Yundong. Ling Yu poked her head in from the door and whispered, "Leader, there's a strange person downstairs. He's holding a blue and white porcelain jar and is staring at our house. Moreover, this person seems to be a cultivator." Li Yundong was stunned. "Huh? Is that so?" At this time, Chris also let out a cry and nodded in agreement. "Yes, I saw him when I went upstairs, but I didn't pay much attention." Li Yundong walked quickly to the window, opened the curtains and looked down. Sure enough, he saw a middle-aged man holding a porcelain jar. He was looking up and glaring in the direction of Li Yundong's house with extreme hatred. Li Yundong's heart sank. He knew that the person downstairs was none other than Yu Tian. This guy had actually come to find him. What did he want to do? Chapter 752. Li Yundong stared at Yu Tian and walked out with a sullen face. As soon as he went out, he saw Ziyuan coming out from the opposite door. Ziyuan saw him at a glance and said, "Did you see Yu Tian?" Li Yundong nodded. Ziyuan sighed softly and said, "Talk to him nicely. It's fine if it makes sense, but if it doesn't, there's nothing we can do. However, don't hurt him. After all, he's also a victim. His family has been ruined." Li Yundong smiled slightly and said, "Don't worry. If I touch him now, won't it be a false accusation?" Ziyuan nodded slightly and said with a smile, "Then I'll go down with you." As they spoke, the two of them went downstairs together. When Yu Tian saw Li Yundong and Ziyuan, the pupils in his eyes instantly widened. He subconsciously hugged the urn in his arms and took a step back. When Li Yundong and Ziyuan walked up to Yu Tian, Ziyuan first bowed and said, "Amateus Jinrenyu. Nice to meet you." Yu Tian took another step back and stared at Ziyuan with great vigilance. He sneered and said, "Don't pretend to be polite." As he spoke, Yu Tian's eyes fell on Li Yundong, full of paranoia and hatred. These days he had been running around trying to find the power of other sects to uphold justice for him. However, the Jingyi school and the Chuanjin sect were unwilling to stand up for him, so how could the other sects be willing to stand up for him? Even Wang Jinyuan kept persuading him to give up, but the more Wang Jinyuan tried to persuade him, the deeper the hatred in Yu Tian's heart became. At first, his hatred was focused on Su Chan, but the more he was rejected, the more his hatred was focused on Li Yundong. In Yu Tian's opinion, if it weren't for Li Yundong, he would have gotten his revenge long ago. Li Yundong was really the number one villain in the cultivation world, the number one devil. Yu Tian stared at Li Yundong and sneered. "Are you Li Yundong?" Li Yundong sighed and said, "Jinrenyu, I think we must have misunderstood each other. The murderer that night was really not Su Chan but someone else. The reason why I took Su Chan there was because I wanted to ask Leader Yu for help. I had no intention of harming her. At that time, Leader Yu also agreed to help us. What reason do I have to do it?" Yu Tian laughed angrily. Isn't that simple? Of course you're going for the secret heaven patching technique. If you have the guts, then say that you didn't get the heaven patching mystic art. Li Yundong's heart trembled. Just as he was about to say that he would return the secret method of patching heaven to him, he suddenly thought of something and thought to himself, no, this Yu Tian suddenly came to my house and talked to me without fear. There must be something wrong with this. Isn't he afraid of being silenced by me? Or is there someone watching us in the dark? If I took out the heaven patching secret technique now, wouldn't I be confirming his previous words? What would they do if Yu Tian were to bite them again? In an instant, Li Yundong's thoughts raced like lightning, and he swallowed back the words that were about to come out of his mouth. He said in a deep voice, Jinrenyu, calm down. If I had ordered someone, even if you had Master Wan by your side to protect you that night, you wouldn't have survived. Do you admit that? Yu Tian sneered and said, I admit it. But I also admit that some people have a guilty conscience. Seeing that Yu Tian was so paranoid that he couldn't be reasoned with, Li Yundong couldn't help but shake his head. He looked around and said, Jinrenyu, tell your people to disperse. I won't do anything to you. First, I didn't do this murder and I didn't order it. Second, I'm also investigating this matter to prove my innocence. Third, we are all victims. I deeply sympathize with what happened to you, Jinrenyu. I will do everything I can to help you find the murderer and give you justice. Yu Tian saw that Li Yundong's tone was sincere, and he didn't seem to be lying at all. He couldn't help but be moved, and his originally firm and paranoid heart wavered for a moment. Seeing that he was wavering, Li Yundong tried to persuade him again. Jinrenyu, think about it. Why would I take the risk of losing my reputation to do such a thing? Moreover, even if I did it, why didn't I grit my teeth and kill you at that time? I know that you have visited a lot of sects these days to ask for help, but have you ever thought that so many sects are afraid of my power? No matter how powerful I, Li Yundong, am I able to deter all the sects in the Chinese cultivation world by myself? I don't think so. As the saying goes, God is watching what people do. Whether I, Li Yundong, have done such an outrageous thing, God will give you an explanation in the future and naturally He will give you justice. When the truth comes to light one day, I, Li Yundong, am willing to personally capture this murderer in front of you and let you deal with him. If there is a single lie in my mouth, let me be struck by lightning. Yu Tian was silent. He stared at Li Yundong like a wolf and an eagle. He wanted to see a trace of hypocrisy, uneasiness and guilt on Li Yundong's face, but no matter how he looked, he could only see sincerity and sincerity in Li Yundong's eyes. Yu Tian stared at Li Yundong for a long time before he slowly stepped back. After taking a few steps back, he said unwillingly, I will keep an eye on you and so will God. Remember what you said. Li Yundong said seriously, don't worry, Jinrenyu. I will remember every word I said before. I will definitely give you justice. Justice, justice. Yu Tian stood where he was, holding the urn tightly in his arms and muttering to himself in a low voice. He couldn't help but think of the scene where he had been running into a wall in all the major sects these days. For a moment he had mixed feelings. Yu Tian couldn't help laughing and 2 lines of tears rolled down his cheeks. As he laughed, he walked out of the community, ignoring the surprised gazes of the other people in the community. After walking out of the community, a middle-aged man slowly followed behind him. It was Wang Jinyuan. Yu Tian saw Wang Jinyuan at a glance and was silent for a while. At this time Wang Jinyuan sighed and said, Alas, good eloquence, really good eloquence. Yu Tian was stunned. He suddenly turned his head and said in a low voice, What eloquence? Wang Jinyuan shook his head and sighed. I've heard that a person with good eloquence can fight against 1,000,000 soldiers with his silver tongue. I always thought that this sentence was unbelievable. After all, no matter how eloquent a person is, when faced with 1,000,000 soldiers, it is impossible for him to stop the rolling torrent of the war machine. But now I believe it. Yu Youqian's eyes suddenly burst into a bright light. Master Wan, what do you want to say? Wang Jinyuan looked at Yu Tian and said, Jinrenyu, do you believe Li Yundong's words? Yu Tian hesitated for a moment and said, What he said may have some truth. Yu Tian was originally a language teacher in the school and he was an honest man. When an honest man went crazy he became more and more terrifying. When he bit people he would bite them to the bone. However, as he kept running into a wall these days, his crazy anger and hatred were slowly being tortured. Today when he met Li Yundong and talked with him, he was moved by Li Yundong's sincerity and his heart slowly calmed down. He was inclined to be a rational person. As soon as he calmed down, he immediately thought that there were many things wrong. However, Wang Jinyuan was not willing to let him calm down. He immediately added fuel to the fire and said, "Do you believe the reasoning he told you or do you believe his vow? Hey Jinryu, you underestimate Li Yundong. He can defeat the entire Japanese cultivation world alone. It can be said that although there are only more than 200 Japanese cultivators from Mount Longhu, they are all top masters in the Japanese cultivation world. They are the elites of the elites. Li Yundong can defeat many Jinshin masters and 2 lightning retribution masters in a row. What does this mean? I shudder when I hear it. When I meet such an opponent, my reaction will definitely be to turn around and run. Even I am like this, let alone others." Jingyi school is now in trouble both internally and externally, and they are unwilling to stand up for you. The Chuanjin Dragon sect has always been on good terms with Li Yundong. If these 2 sects in the cultivation world are like this, how can the other sects be willing to stand up for you? They are all afraid of Li Yundong's divine power. Besides, if you believe his oath, it would be ridiculous. Haven't you noticed that he has already cultivated to the realm of the perfect jade body? This is the highest realm of the immortal Jinshin. He is only 1 step away from the lightning retribution realm. When the thunder awakens, the heavenly thunder will descend. After he passes through the lightning retribution, only the magic formation and the 9 thunders in the world can harm him. How can he be afraid of the 5 thunders? These words suddenly made Yu Youtian's eyes widen, and his whole body tremble. He clenched his fists tightly and his face turned purple. He roared in a low voice, ashamed and angry, "So that's how it is, so that's how it is. You lied to me." When Wang Jinyuan saw that Yu Yutian was pointing the spear at Li Yundong again, he couldn't help but feel happy in his heart. However, his face was full of compassion. He sighed and said, "Jinryu, you are an honest man. It's not good for you to be so gullible." Yu Yutian flew into a rage. He turned around and walked toward Li Yundong's home. "I'll go find him again." However, Wang Jinyuan stopped him and said, "Forget it. I've already sent away the cameraman you invited just now. If you want to take a picture of him attacking you, you definitely won't be able to. Li Yundong is not stupid. Even if he is, Ziyuan beside him is not." As he spoke, Wang Jinyuan patted Yu Yutian with a heavy expression and sighed, "Jinryu, your opponent, is really too powerful." Yu Youtian's chest rose and fell violently. The corners of his eyes were so wide that they looked as if they were going to split open. A low roar then burst out from between his teeth. Could it be? "I, Yu Youtian, am unable to avenge the murder of my wife and son just like that?" However, Wang Jinyuan's expression suddenly changed and he said, "No, it's not that there's no way to take revenge, but we have to think about it in the long run. Think about it in the long run." Yu Yutian repeated these words in a low voice several times. Suddenly he laughed bitterly and said, "Li Yundong is so powerful at such a young age. I'm almost 50 years old. How can I think about it in the long run?" Wang Jinyuan smiled slightly. His smile was like the devil of Avicii luring a lost soul. He said with a compassionate face, "Jinryu, I know a top master. His cultivation is not inferior to any cultivator in the world, and he is chivalrous and brave. It's best to fight against injustice. If you find him, he will definitely help you take revenge." Yu Youtian's eyes suddenly narrowed and his breathing quickened. "Who is it?" Chapter 753. After Yu Yutian left, Li Yundong, who was on his way home, suddenly asked Ziyuan, "Do you think Yu Yutian will change his mind and let it go?" Ziyuan pondered for a while and said, "It's hard to say. I once heard from my master that Yu Qing had found an honest man to be her husband. At that time, the older generation of cultivators in the cultivation world were very surprised. If Yu Yutian was really an honest man, he might not have thought of a way to provoke you to attack him. Moreover, no matter how rational a person is, he can't stand being fanned by someone next to him. If someone egged him on, I'm afraid he would go down the wrong path." Li Yundong stopped at the door and sighed. "I hope he doesn't go too deep." But after entering the house, Li Yundong was surprised to find that Chris was sitting on the sofa in the living room, covering her mouth with one hand and tears falling down. Li Yundong and Ziyuan immediately looked at each other. In their impression, Chris had a strong character, and sometimes she was resolute and decisive. She was not inferior to Zhou Qin at all. They had never seen Chris so weak. Li Yundong couldn't help walking over to her and asking, "Chris, what happened? Why are you crying?" Chris raised her head and looked at Li Yundong with tears in her eyes. Her eyes were full of unwillingness, sadness, and struggle. After staring at him for a while, she suddenly stood up, hugged Li Yundong and sobbed. "My grandma is seriously ill and in the hospital. I miss her." Li Yundong hadn't expected that Chris would suddenly hug him. He opened his arms, not knowing whether to hug her or where to put them. He looked at Ziyuan helplessly, but she turned her face away and didn't look at him at all. Li Yundong had no choice but to pat Chris on the shoulder and ask softly, "Hey Chris, calm down. How did your grandma suddenly become seriously ill? I remember you told me about her. Isn't she a very healthy person? When your brother came to ask you to go back, did he give you false information?" Chris cried on Li Yundong's shoulder for a long time. Then she raised her head, wiped her tears, shook her head and said, "I just called back to ask. My father and mother both said that my grandmother suddenly had a cerebral thrombosis and was in a severe coma. She was admitted to the hospital and is now unconscious. I just called the hospital and asked about it. I also contacted the head nurse in charge of my health. She told me that my grandma might have a hard time this time." Chris had grown up with her grandmother and had a deep relationship with her. Once she confirmed that Lin Guang had fallen ill, Chris immediately panicked. She was so anxious to return home that she couldn't wait to rush back to her grandmother's side. When Li Yundong heard what she said, he secretly admired Chris for being so meticulous at such a critical moment. If it were anyone else, they would have thrown the phone away and immediately bought a plane ticket to rush back. But Chris was still calm enough to call the hospital and even find the head nurse. Amazing, really amazing. Li Yundong thought to himself, regardless of the race of Chris's skin, the courage and meticulousness this woman showed during the school shooting are enough to make people look at her with admiration. At this time, in the face of danger, she was able to grasp the key to the problem at once and couldn't control her emotions until she confirmed the facts. Such a firm will is really rare. In the future, if her cultivation is successful with her character, I'm afraid that she will also be a first-class fighter. This thought flashed through Li Yundong's mind. He patted Chris on the shoulder and comforted her. "Don't worry. Filial piety is the most important of all virtues. Don't think that we cultivators are cold-blooded animals who don't eat the food of the world and don't care about worldly feelings. You should go back quickly." Chris looked at Li Yundong gratefully and turned to walk to her room. But after taking 2 steps, she turned around again and said with a worried face, "Master, if I go back this time, I won't be able to come back again, will I?" Li Yundong looked at her worried and unwilling expression and suddenly laughed. "What's wrong? Are you tired of being a nominal disciple? Or do you dislike me for not teaching you cultivation?" Chris lowered her head, forced a smile and said bitterly, "I know. I'm an outsider, an outsider. You will always have a lot of concerns." Li Yundong fixed his eyes on Chris. He suddenly walked over and pulled her to the sofa. He patted her on the shoulder and motioned for her to sit down. "Chris, in fact, skin and race are not important. What's important is the huge difference between us. In the eyes of Americans, you are a national expert, but can you really understand the real language? Not to mention you, even I find it difficult to read it. I'm afraid that only people like Ziyuan can read it smoothly and freely. Moreover, when you read the poems, can you really feel the beauty of these poems like we do?" Li Yundong sighed and said, "You are very good, but can you translate the sentence, sparse shadows slanting across the clear water, faint fragrance floating in the moonlight at dusk, perfectly? Even if you can the translated sentence have the artistic conception of this poem? For example, your proudest poet, Whitman. In his Leaves of Grass, I remember there is a poem called From the Vast Sea of People. When translated, a few lines of the poem are, From the vast sea of people, a drop of dew comes slowly and whispers to me, I love you and soon I will die. After walking through thousands of mountains and rivers, I just want to see you and touch you. As long as I don't see you, I won't leave the world because I'm afraid of losing you." Chris, I dare say that in our country, as long as a person is a little conceited, he will dare to pat his chest and say that his poem is 100 times or even 10,000 times better than this poem. Could it be that they had really picked Whitman? No, this is caused by the huge gap between the East and the West. The translation of The Dream of the Red Chamber and The Romance of the Three Kingdoms will always be niche books for Westerners, but in our East, these are classics that everyone must read. As he spoke, Li Yundong pressed his hand on Chris's shoulder. A wave of heat emanated from his palm, making Chris feel an inexplicable and powerful force enveloping her body, filling her body and mind with a sense of awe. It was as if the person standing in front of her was not a boy who was a little younger than her, but a giant who could support the sky and the earth. Li Yundong saw that Chris was looking at him with an inexplicable awe. He smiled and continued to untie the knot in Chris's heart. He said, "Chris, it's not that I don't want to teach you cultivation. If I teach you cultivation, I can guarantee that within a year, you will be able to reach the Jinshin phase. I can even teach you to be the best female cultivator in the world. You Westerners have unique physical conditions for cultivation. You can get started quickly, see results quickly, and fight fiercely. This is determined by the constitution of the furnace. But I can guarantee that after you reach the Jinshin phase, you will not be able to make any further progress. Do you know why? Chris shook her head blankly. She felt that she was like a child who knew nothing, while Li Yundong was like a knowledgeable master. She could only listen to the man talk in front of her in fear. Li Yundong smiled slightly and said, "Because if I want to teach you cultivation, you will definitely do as I say. You only know how it is, but you don't know why it is. Because with your Western thinking, you can't fully understand everything I'm saying. The huge difference and estrangement will cause you to encounter a huge bottleneck after you enter the Jinshin phase. You can't understand what nature means and the unity of heaven and man are. You can't understand what the infinite void is and what all the methods are. You have a good foundation, but at best, you are only at the level of a 5th or 6th grade primary school student. It will be as difficult as ascending to heaven for you to understand all this. Your cultivation talent is not bad. You are an excellent human cauldron, and your luck is also good. If you can't make any further progress after reaching the Jinshin phase and become a powerful fighter, it would be a pity. I hope that you can have a higher realm and attainments in the future. Do you understand?" Chris looked at Li Yundong in horror. Her mouth wriggled and she kept asking herself, "Can I really reach the realm that Master said? Can I really? Does Master think so highly of me?" Chris had originally been a very arrogant girl, but the longer she had been dealing with Li Yundong, the more she had been unconvinced at the beginning, to curiosity, to worship, to awe, and now to panic and confusion. Especially when Li Yundong had pressed his hand on her just now, Chris even felt as if she had become a small stone in an instant, while Li Yundong was a big Buddha standing alone. Seeing the confusion in her eyes, Li Yundong knew that she must be struggling in her heart. He patted Chris on the shoulder and said, "Don't think about it for now. It will take a long time to fly from Tiannan City to Harrisburg. Think about it slowly when the time comes." Chris glanced at Li Yundong, and her plump red lips wriggled slightly. She swallowed the words that were about to come out of her mouth. She lowered her head and slowly walked towards her room, her steps so heavy as if she was carrying a mountain on her back. Ziyuan, who had been silent all this time, suddenly said to Li Yundong in a low voice, "By the way, Li Yundong, let Su-chan go with her. Recently, I've been worried that something will happen. Let Su-chan go with her so that no one will make a fuss about her being framed. It can be considered as going out to hide." Li Yundong was stunned for a moment, and then his eyes lit up. He smiled and said, "Okay. Chaner has never been abroad before. Hey, by the way, why don't you go with her?" Ziyuan was also stunned. Me too?" Li Yundong smiled and said, "I can't go. I can't leave the Fox Zen school now. Besides, in a while it will be time to go through the Thunder Retribution and I can't leave. What's more, I'm worried about Chaner going alone. I'll be relieved if you go." As he said this, he looked at Chris, who was walking with heavy steps. He suddenly lowered his voice and said, "Besides, your medical skills are excellent. Maybe you can treat Chris's grandmother when you get there. If Chris is really tricked into going back and is treated badly, you can still help her." Ziyuan stared at Li Yundong and suddenly laughed. "I saw that you were cold to Chris before, so I thought you didn't care about this cheap disciple at all. Now I know that you treat her like a treasure." Li Yundong looked at Chris's back and smiled slowly. "How many people in the world have the good fortune to let her be transformed by the Dyunjin Dan? If I let such a person go, she will immediately be accepted as a disciple by other sections. Won't I make a strong enemy for myself later?" Ziyuan smiled and said, "Okay, I know what you're thinking. I'll go. Don't worry." As she said this, she turned and walked to her room, ready to pack her luggage. Li Yundong looked at her back and smiled. He had another purpose for sending Ziyuan away, to give her a surprise and compensation. Before she came back, he wanted to learn the secret method of patching heaven and repair her powerful magical weapon. If Ziyuan were there with her character, she would definitely not allow Li Yundong to read the secret method of patching heaven, so Li Yundong could only send her away as far as possible. After watching Ziyuan leave, Li Yundong returned to his room and opened the secret method of patching heaven. A line of words popped up on the first line. In the past, Gonggong and Zhuanshu fought for the throne. They were so angry that they touched the Buzhou mountain. The pillar of heaven was broken and the earth was destroyed. The sky tilted to the northwest, so the sun, moon, and stars moved. The earth was not satisfied to the southwest, so the water and dust returned. Nuwa refined the five-colored godstone to mend the sky, and we refined the five-colored Niden to mend the sky. This technique responds to the mandate of heaven and invites heaven's merit. It is really the best technique in the world. Li Yundong was shocked when he saw the inscription on the title page. There were 3 words written on it: Zhang Sanfeng. Chapter 754. Li Yundong suddenly saw that the signature on the title page was Zhang Sanfeng, the founder of the Sanfeng sect of Taoism. He immediately picked up the book in surprise and looked at it carefully. But after reading for a while, Li Yundong found that although the book looked a little old, it was definitely not an antique cultural relic that had been passed down for hundreds of years. It must be a reprint. Perhaps Zhang Sanfeng had mentioned the preface to this secret book. But when Li Yundong flipped to the next page, he saw that the first sentence of the thick black seal script at the beginning of the book was written, "The way of heaven, take away the surpluses and make up for the deficiencies." Then there was a detailed description of cultivation methods. Before Li Yundong had met Su Chan, his understanding of the way of heaven is to make up for what is lacking had always been based on Jin Yong's Nine Sutra. However, after cultivating and reading the ancient books, Li Yundong realized that this sentence came from the 77th chapter of Lao Zi's Tao Te Ching. If the inner canon of the Yellow Emperor was a must-read enlightenment for cultivators, then the Tao Te Ching by Lao Zi, the founder of Taoism, was a must-read high-level internal reference for every cultivator. There was even a saying in the cultivation world that whoever couldn't understand the Tao Te Ching would have no hope for the thunder retribution in his life. The Zhuji phase relied on the strength of one's own furnace and one's own external conditions. The same was true for Shintong and Yang spirit. Similarly, the Jinshin phase could also be achieved with a huge amount of money in addition to chance coincidences. However, after reaching the Jinshin phase, one must truly understand the realm of cultivation and the philosophical ideas in cultivation. It was absolutely impossible not to be smart. Otherwise, cultivators couldn't understand the sentence in Lao Zi's Tao Te Ching: "The Tao begets one, one begets two, two begets three, three begets all things. Man follows the earth follows the heaven follows the Tao, and the Tao follows nature." How could they talk about following the heart and moving heaven and earth with a thought? If they couldn't achieve the unity of heaven and man, how could they talk about the top level of the Jinshin phase? If they didn't cultivate to the top level of the Jinshin phase, how could they survive the thunder retribution? In a few minutes, the heavenly thunder would smash the half-baked Jinshin into pieces. As an experienced person, Li Yundong naturally knew that 1, 2 and 3 seemed simple, but since ancient times there had been countless cultivators in Chinese history, but there were only a few who had really understood 1, 2 and 3. It could even be said that Celestial Master Zhang of Mount Longhu might not have been able to understand 1, 2 and 3 for every generation. However, there was no doubt that the person who wrote this secret manual had comprehended the 1, 2, 3 within it. This sentence, "The way of heaven, take away surpluses and mend deficiencies," was talking about the way of magical treasures. The power of magic treasures came from the heavens, and the way of the heavens is to take away excess and make up for deficiency. This meant that after a magic treasure was created, if no one used it, it would lose more power than it could replenish itself, and its power would continue to decline. Although Dharma treasures were intelligent, they were inanimate objects after all. They were not like the spirit of all living things, humans who knew how to cultivate and constantly improve themselves. Therefore, if a magical treasure wanted to become stronger, if it wanted to repair itself after being damaged, it needed the help of others. This was the first sentence in the second chapter that Li Yundong opened. The way of man is to take away the insufficiency and make up for the excess. When these two meanings were combined, it meant that Dharma treasures did not know how to cultivate themselves, so their Dharma power was constantly losing and declining. However, humans were the spirit of all living things. They knew how to cultivate themselves and store excess essence qi. Therefore, it was to take away the insufficiency and make up for the excess. Why did the strength of cultivators increase? Why did the more jinqi cultivated, the stronger it became? Why did people grow up? Why did people get fatter the more they ate? The reason was very simple. Laozi, the founder of Taoism in 571 BC, Taishang Laojun of the Nine Heavens Divine Night Realm, had long given the answer: take away the insufficiency and make up for the excess. It was also because of this that cultivators could use their own the way of man, giving away the excess to make up for the way of heaven, making up for the deficiency. This was the theoretical basis why Taoist cultivators firmly believed that man could conquer heaven. Although Li Yundong had read many cultivation classics, none of them had explained the way of heaven and the way of man so thoroughly and so brightly. As Li Yundong flipped through the classics, he sighed in his heart. The Penglai sect is indeed worthy of being a powerful sect that was once prosperous. Although I don't know how glorious this sect was at its peak, the classics left behind by the Penglai sect are enough to make the author of this book famous in history. A cultivator who can write such an exquisite cultivation article must be an earth-shattering great cultivator. Li Yundong quickly flipped through the classics, but he didn't find the author's name in it. He couldn't help but sigh and say, in the 5,000 years of Chinese history, how many heroes have been buried in the torrential history? Such a great cultivator didn't leave his mark in the long river of history at all? While he was sighing, Li Yundong couldn't help but see Zhang Sanfeng's preface on the title page. He suddenly thought, could it be that after reading this classic Zhenren Zhang comprehended the truth of cultivation and founded the Sanfeng sect? While Li Yundong was guessing, he suddenly heard a knock on the door. Li Yundong tilted his ear and knew who was knocking. He immediately laughed and quietly walked to the back of the door to hide. After knocking on the door for a while, the person saw that there was no response, so he carefully poked his head in. As soon as he looked around, Li Yundong, who was hiding behind the door, slapped him on the head. This person was none other than Su Chan. Su Chan let out a cry and quickly grabbed upward with one hand. In an instant, a ball of flame jumped up in the palm of her other hand. This ball of flame quickly stretched into the shape of a sharp blade and stabbed toward Li Yundong. Li Yundong quickly smiled and said, "It's me, it's me." However, Su Chan couldn't hold back. The fire sword was about to pierce Li Yundong's chest. Her face changed dramatically and she suddenly wanted to withdraw her strength. But at this time, Li Yundong stretched out his hand and flicked his finger on Su Chan's aggressive fire sword. With a snap, her fire sword was smashed into pieces. For a moment, it turned into countless sparks and quickly disappeared in the air. Li Yundong saw that the place where the fire sword had passed was scorched black. He couldn't help but smile bitterly and say, "Do you want to kill your husband? Where did you learn magic? It's so powerful." However, Su Chan pouted and said unhappily, "What's so powerful about it? You broke the spell that I had been learning for several days with just one finger." Li Yundong pretended to be angry and slapped the girl's round and perky butt. "Nonsense, isn't it powerful? If it had been me in the past, I'm afraid I would have been lying in bed again. Did you come all the way here just to kill your husband?" Su Chan covered her perky buttocks with both hands and said resentfully, "I've been practicing magic for a few days. I just wanted you to see it." Li Yundong couldn't help but laugh when he saw her childish desire to take credit. "What's the matter? You've been in a bad mood these days, so you've been practicing hard? What magic have you learned? Show it to me." However, Su Chan pouted and tilted her head. "No. I've been practicing hard for a few days, but in your eyes, isn't it still like a child playing? Just boring. I won't show it." Li Yundong saw that the little girl's eyes were full of loss and disappointment. It was obvious that he had run over excitedly to show off his treasures, but he hadn't expected that he would destroy her magic with a flick of his finger and sweep away her prestige. The little girl was naturally very disappointed in her heart. Li Yundong put his arms around the little girl's soft waist with a smile, kissed her on the cheek and said with a smile, "Silly, I'm about to go through the thunder retribution. My cultivation is several levels higher than yours. How can I compare with you? If I were still in the Yangshan phase, I would have been hit just now. So, don't belittle yourself. You look so ugly with a straight face. Be careful that I don't like you." As expected, Su Chan was shocked. She quickly covered her face with both hands and said in horror, "Am I really ugly? Then don't look at me. I'm going to touch up some makeup." Women put on makeup for the man they liked, and Su Chan was naturally the same. Her nervous look immediately made Li Yundong laugh. He lovingly picked her up and kissed her heavily. Su Chan hadn't expected that Li Yundong would suddenly kiss her. For a moment, her eyes widened and her body was a little stiff. But soon, her body softened as if she was about to turn into a pool of spring water. She softly melted in Li Yundong's arms. When their lips separated, Su Chan blushed and smiled foolishly. "Why are you kissing me when I'm so ugly?" Li Yundong put on a straight face and pretended to be angry. "Nonsense. Which bastard said that my girl is ugly?" Su Chan giggled and stretched out her jade-like fingers to touch Li Yundong's cheek. "You're so shameless. You're so thick-skinned." Li Yundong chuckled. "I know something even more shameless." As he said this, Li Yundong put on a solemn expression and said seriously, "Benefactor, do you want to reach the Jinshin phase? Do you want to quickly become a great cultivator? Please dial 138x times x times x. If you want to study the Merriman Buddha with me, please dial 1. If you want to study the Merriman Buddha with me, please dial 2. If you want to study the Merriman Buddha with me, please dial 3. If you want to study the Merriman Buddha with me, please dial 4. If you want to study the Merimid Buddha alone, please hang up. For a moment Su Chan's cheeks turned red. She leaned on Li Yundong's shoulder and laughed so hard that her whole body trembled. However, Li Yundong still said seriously, "This benefactor, this Tanyu, this beautiful girl, hurry up and choose your number. Do you want to choose 1, 2, 3 or 4? Please feel free to choose. I won't force you." These days, Su Chan's mind had been heavy and she had been depressed. At this time, when she was teased by Li Yundong, she laughed so hard that the unhappiness in her heart seemed to fly beyond the clouds. She blushed, bit her lips gently with her snow-white teeth and giggled. "Can I choose to hang up the phone?" Li Yundong said in surprise. "What? Haven't you already cultivated this magic skill to the 9th level? You still want to cultivate it? Aren't you afraid of getting calluses?" Su Chan giggled and leaned against Li Yundong's ear, blowing like orchids, but her hand boldly touched Li Yundong's lower body. She looked at him coquettishly and said softly, "Yundong, you are now in the Jinshin phase." With a beauty in his arms, speaking softly and with a faint fragrance, it was really erotic. As soon as Su Chan's hand moved down, Li Yundong immediately became angry. The Vajra pestle was raised high, and the little girl's hand was so scared that she retracted it. But when the little girl's eyes showed a hint of charm that was enough to melt Li Yundong, and when her hand reached down again, Li Yundong grabbed her hand and said softly with a smile, "Little girl, there's still a long time. You'll go out in a while." At this time the little girl was also moved. Her eyes were like silk and she asked with blurred eyes, "What? Why should I go out? I don't want to go out. I want to be with you." Li Yundong laughed, hugged the little girl and kissed her heavily again. Their tongues were entangled and they were locked in a fierce battle. After a long time, Li Yundong injected his pure jinchi into the little girl's mouth. When Su Chan received this jinchi, her whole body suddenly trembled, and her mind slowly became sober. Only then did Li Yundong let go of her. He smiled and told her about Chris, saying, "Accompany her to have a look. Just be her bodyguard this time, okay?" Although Su Chan was reluctant to leave, she also knew that Li Yundong actually wanted her to leave this troublesome place for a while, so she used this excuse. The little girl looked at Li Yundong reluctantly, drawing circles on his chest with her fingers, and said with some resentment, "But how long will it take?" Li Yundong said with a smile, "It will be very soon. It will be a few days, at least 10 days at most. Anyway, I will definitely come back before the spring festival. If you want to spend it outside, I won't allow it." Only then did Su Chan's worry turn into joy. But just as the little girl was about to speak, she suddenly heard Chris's surprised voice coming from outside. "Shiji Ziyuan, what are you doing? What are you thinking about?" Ziyuan's panicked voice came from the door. I'm fine. Are you okay? Let's go quickly." As she said this, she cleared her throat and pretended to be calm as she said to Li Yundong, "Li Yundong, we have to go." Li Yunyang took Su Chan's little hand and went out of the door, only to see that Ziyuan had already hidden at the door. Although her back was facing him, from her snow-white and slender neck, he could still see that this fairy sister's face was blushing all the way to the root of her neck. The pink and decadent color was really frightening. Only then did Li Yundong realize that Ziyuan had been eavesdropping just now. This fairy sister is not kind. Late at night, I worked hard to finish a chapter. Benefactors, Tanyu, beautiful girls, do you want to understand the happy Buddha? Do you want to choose 1, 2, 3 or 4? Please feel free to choose, I will not force you. Hey, I'm just kidding. Recently, some readers have been asking me about opening a group. Many enthusiastic readers want to provide me with a VIP group, but a group of 200 people is really a little inadequate, so I'd better consider opening a super group of 500 people in the future. Now the super group is open. 823139993. If you want to join, hurry up. This group will probably be full in a day. However, I will go to sleep in a while and I guess the group leader will also go to sleep. There are only 2 administrators in the group, so even if the children add in the middle of the night, I'm afraid they won't be able to get in. It's better to wait until tomorrow morning. Chapter 755. After realizing that Ziyuan might have heard the intimate voices of him and Su Chan just now, Li Yundong's expression suddenly became very strange. He couldn't help but turn his head to look at Su Chan, only to see that the little girl's face was flushed, white and rosy, like a ripe cherry, making people want to take a bite. Li Yundong patted the little girl's head with a smile and said, "Well, hurry up and pack your luggage. Ziyuan and Chris are waiting for you." Su Chan responded in a low voice and ran into her room. When she came out again, she was dragging a huge suitcase, 2 big bags in her hands and a cloth bag on her back. The corner of a pillow was exposed in the cloth bag. Obviously, the little girl had packed all the bedding and other things. Li Yundong was stunned and said in surprise, "Are you running away from home?" Su Chan said blankly, "Running away from home? No, didn't you ask me to go back with Chris?" Li Yundong didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "Why did you bring so many things? When we get there, will Chris still be hungry or cold? Come on, just bring a change of clothes. Be good and put everything back." Su Chan turned around sulkily and was about to drag all the things to get them. Chris, who was beside her, also chuckled and said, "Su Chan, you can go empty-handed. When you get off the plane, I'll arrange for someone to buy whatever you need." Su Chan suddenly asked tentatively, "Can I go shopping and buy clothes?" Before Chris could speak, Li Yundong glared at her and said, "Su Chan, do you really think you're going to play? Don't be shy." Chris smiled and said, "No problem. You and Ziyuan can play in Harrisburg for a while. Although this city is not very big and has a small population, only tens of thousands of people, there is a restaurant called He Family's Chocolate that is very good. I recommend you go and have a look, but I may have to accompany Grandma, so I can't go shopping with you. Of course, I can ask my family to accompany you." Su Chan waved her hand and said with a smile, "It's okay. When we get off the plane, I'll ask Sister Ziyuan to see what's wrong with your grandma first. After Sister Ziyuan has cured your grandma, we'll go shopping, okay?" As she said this, she rushed over to Ziyuan, held her arm and said with a smile, "Sister Ziyuan, what do you think?" Ziyuan had originally wanted to say goodbye to Li Yundong, but she hadn't expected to accidentally hear the intimate private conversation between Li Yundong and Su Chan at the door. For a moment she was a little stunned, but Crazy had accidentally exposed her. She was embarrassed and her cheeks blushed for a long time. At this time it was difficult to calm down, but Su Chan jumped over again. Ziyuan glanced at Su Chan helplessly. She secretly admired that this girl had a big heart that couldn't bear to be sad. Even when she encountered a big event like the Penglai murder case, she was only sad for a few days and then she recovered as before. Su Chan's smiling face didn't look the least bit gloomy. It had to be said that she was heartless and open-minded, but it was indeed a skill to be able to be so open-minded and cheerful. Ziyuan looked at Su Chan helplessly and said, "I may not be able to cure Crazy's grandma. I still don't know what's going on with her." Su Chan waved her hand carelessly and said, "It's okay. Except for Yundong, you are the best. There's nothing that can stump you. As long as you take action, this kind of small thing will definitely be easy." Ziyuan smiled helplessly and said to Crazy, "Don't get your hopes up. I'm not as good as she says." Chris knew that her grandmother was living in the best hospital in Harrisburg and receiving the best treatment. Although she admired the magical powers possessed by Li Yundong, Ziyuan, and the others, if Western medicine could not solve the problem of snatching a patient with severe cerebral thrombosis back from the arms of death, she was afraid that these Easterners might not be able to solve the problem either. Because of this, Crazy didn't take Su Chan's words to heart, but she still nodded politely and smiled gratefully. "It's good that you have this intention. I appreciate it very much." Li Yundong, who was standing to one side, smiled and said, "Well, don't be so polite. Let's talk about it on the way." Ziyuan smiled and said, "Then we'll go first." Su Chan also waved at Li Yundong and said, "Yundong, if Sister Ziyuan can't cure it, you can come over and help." Li Yundong didn't know whether to laugh or cry. If Ziyuan couldn't cure it, would he be able to? But he couldn't say this. He smiled and pinched the little girl's cheek, then winked at her and said, "Don't make trouble for Ziyuan outside." Su Chan slapped Li Yundong's hand away and said angrily, "You're so annoying. I'm not a child anymore." Li Yundong smiled and nodded to Ziyuan and Crazy, then saw them out of the door. After watching the three of them leave the community, Li Yundong turned around and returned to his room, carefully studying the secret method of patching heaven. Unknowingly, he had been studying it for 3 or 4 hours. When there was a knock on the door, Li Yundong came to his senses and said loudly, "Come in, the door is open." As soon as the door was pushed open, Zhou Qin stood at the door and asked curiously, "Master, why is there no one at home? I went to the other side and saw that Ziyuan was not there either." Li Yundong put down his hand and asked, "Where's Ruan Hongling?" Zhou Qin pursed her lips and smiled. "Hongling is helping in the tea house. The shop is too busy to take care of her. Only you are here leisurely. What are you doing?" Li Yundong waved at her and motioned for her to come in. He said with a smile, "Crazy's grandmother is seriously ill and is in a hurry to go back. I asked Ziyuan and Su Chan to go back with her." Zhou Qin suddenly smiled, but her eyes fell on the book in Li Yundong's hand. She looked at it for a while and asked curiously, "Is this the secret method of patching heaven that you brought back from the Penglai sect?" After Li Yundong had returned home, although he had hidden the matter of the Penglai sect from the whole Fox Zen school, he had been blunt with Zhou Qin, so she had recognized the secret record at a glance. Li Yundong nodded. He handed the secret method of patching heaven in his hand to Zhou Qin and said, "I originally wanted to copy this book, but my handwriting is too ugly so I didn't." "You can copy it." Zhou Qin hurriedly waved her hand. No, if we copy it and someone finds out, won't it be a false accusation?" Li Yundong couldn't help laughing. "Haven't you always been very bold?" Zhou Qin stared at Li Yundong with a complicated look in her eyes and suddenly whispered, "Master, I'm not afraid, but you can't have your reputation tarnished." Li Yundong stared at the beautiful lady in front of him and suddenly said with a smile, "Don't be silly. I asked you to make a copy not because I want to covet the magic recorded in this cultivation manual. I just don't want such a peerless magic to disappear from the world. If people scold me after this, let them scold me. Anyway, I don't think I'll be able to listen to it." Only then did Zhou Qin understand. She looked at Li Yundong with admiration and said, "Master, you're right. I'll make a copy now. As long as you have a clear conscience, it doesn't matter what others say, right?" Li Yundong nodded with a smile and said, "That's the truth. Go ahead." Zhou Qin took the secret method of heaven patching and turned to go out. Li Yundong looked at her slim figure and smiled slightly. He turned his face and continued to ponder about Yu Tian. But not long after Li Yundong thought about it, Zhou Qin came in with a stack of paper and said with a smile, "I've done it." Li Yundong was startled. "What? So fast? Are you a clerk? Even a clerk isn't as fast as you, right? It's only been less than 15 minutes, hasn't it?" Zhou Qin covered her mouth and giggled. "Master, you've cultivated so hard that your brain has become stupid. Don't you know that there is a machine called a photocopier?" Li Yundong's eyes widened. "A photocopier? Where can we get a photocopier?" Zhou Qin looked at Li Yundong helplessly. "Master, there is a photocopier downstairs." Li Yundong also looked at Zhou Qin helplessly. "Zhou Qin, Miss Zhou, you can't be lazy like this, can you? If someone sees you copying the secret method of heaven patching, what will they think? Isn't it like yellow mud falling into your pants? Even if it's not sh*t, it's still sh*t? Zhou Qin smiled and waved her hand. "Don't worry, I've specially looked around. Besides, the copy is 100% correct. If I make a mistake in copying a word, wouldn't it be a huge mistake?" Li Yundong smiled and said, "You can find an excuse to be lazy. Okay, I'm convinced. Give me the original copy. By the way, you can take a look at the copy. Although this book is about how to repair powerful magical weapons, the description of cultivation methods in it is still very beneficial to people. You can study it carefully." Zhou Qin had always been by Li Yundong's side without any complaints or requests. She had used all her yearning and secret love for Li Yundong on the way of cultivation. Could be said that she was a cultivation maniac. As long as she had time, she would seize the time to practice. However, she had been too busy in the tea house recently, and she had been busy dealing with some worldly affairs, so her cultivation had been slightly delayed. But at this time, when she heard that there was such a precious and rare cultivation method, Zhou Qin was so excited that her eyes lit up. She held the code as if she had found a treasure and rushed back. But not long after, Zhou Qin rushed back and said carefully to Li Yundong, "Master, someone wants to see you." Li Yundong asked curiously, "Who wants to see me?" Zhou Qin's cheeks turned red, which was rare for her. She stammered, Yes. My father wants to see you." Li Yundong became more and more confused. "Zhou Kachang wants to see me?" Zhou Qin shook her head in embarrassment and said, "If you don't want to see him, then I'll refuse for you." Li Yundong looked at Zhou Qin, only to see that although her eyes were evasive, there was a faint hope in them, as if she was eager for him to agree. Although Li Yundong didn't like to deal with bureaucrats, this person was different. He was Zhou Qin's father. If he didn't agree, Zhou Qin would be very embarrassed, wouldn't she? Li Yundong thought for a moment and said with a smile, "No need." "When and where?" Zhou Qin's face lit up with joy. "Today, just downstairs." Li Yundong took a deep breath. "Good heavens, you act first and report later." Chapter 756. Just as Zhou Kachang silently found Li Yundong's house, Wang Jinyuan took Yu Tian to the Sevenly Mountain Pond in Dongwu City. Yu Tian was a language teacher, so his foundation was naturally very good. He could be considered half a human. At this moment, even though he had a blood feud, when he saw the picturesque scenery of the Seven-Li Pond, he couldn't help but sigh deeply. Dong Yu Wu's reputation is indeed well-deserved. Yu Tian looked at the bluestone road of the Seven-Li Mountain Pond and sighed with emotion. Although he had never been to Dongwu City, he knew the reputation of the Seven-Li Mountain Pond. In 85 AD, which was the second year of the Baoli dynasty and the Tang dynasty, the great poet Bai Ji was transferred from Hangzhou to the provincial governor of the Dongwu Kingdom. In order to facilitate the water transportation of the Dongwu Kingdom, he dug a mountain pond river from Tiger Hill in the west to Changmen in the east. He built a road north of the Mountain Pond River and called it Mountain Pond Street. The Mountain Pond River and Mountain Pond Street were about 7 miles long, so this place was called the Seven-Li Mountain Pond. The information and deeds about the Seven-Li Mountain Pond flashed through Yu Youtian's mind like a carousel lantern. He usually boasted that he was an elegant person, but now he was not in the mood to appreciate such a beautiful scenery of the Dongwu Kingdom at all. He saw many family reuniting and laughing as they took pictures together at various scenic spots. For a moment he couldn't help but think of the dead Yu Qing and Yu Manlu. His heart ached, and as he recalled the scene, tears streamed down his face. Seeing that he was sad, Wang Jinyuan deliberately changed the topic to distract him. He said with a smile, "Jinrenyu, you are a native of Shandong. This is the first time you have come to the beautiful land of Jiangnan. You feel different from the north, don't you?" Yu Tian turned around and wiped his tears. The corners of his mouth twitched as he said with a smile, "The scenery of Penglai is magnificent and majestic, but it is full of vicissitudes of life. It is spectacular but not delicate. The scenic spots of the Dongwu Kingdom are beautiful and small, but they are full of beauty and tactfulness. They are full of beauty but not spectacular." Wang Jinyuan clapped his hands and said with a smile, "Well said. You deserve to be a language teacher. I can't say such things casually." Yu Tian smiled sadly and said in an incomparably low voice, "As the saying goes, a scholar is a useless scholar. Only now did I fully comprehend this sentence. When Yu Qing married me in the past, I always wondered why someone as outstanding as her would take a fancy to a scholar like me who couldn't carry a heavy load. Later on, Qing told me that she liked my ability to speak eloquently, and she liked the way I wrote. But now I know what's the use of that. In the past, I always looked down on my wife's path of cultivation. I thought that everything was inferior and only studying was good. I just wanted to cater to her and have more in common with her. That's why I decided to cultivate this Tao out of curiosity." With that, Yu Tian raised his head and let out a long sigh. He said sorrowfully, "When Qing Xiao Lu and I were separated forever, I realized that the path of cultivation was the true path of the world." As he spoke, Yu Tian couldn't help but cry again. He wiped his tears and looked at Wang Jinyuan. "Master Wan, where is this chivalrous master you were talking about? As long as he can help me take revenge, I am willing to do anything for him." Wang Jinyuan waved his hand and said, "Hey Jinrenyu, what are you talking about? I promise you that as long as you ask, this person will definitely stand up for you." Yu Tian couldn't help but tremble with excitement. "Where is this person? Take me there quickly." Wang Jinyuan smiled and said, "Don't worry, we'll be there soon." As he spoke, he pointed to an inconspicuous old house in the depths of Seven-Li Mountain Pond. At a glance, Yu Tian saw the old house with cornices, white walls, black tiles, and a pair of stone lions at the door. For a moment he was stunned. "This great master lives in such a place?" Wang Jinyuan smiled and said, "A great hermit hides in the court, and a hidden hermit in the city." Yu Tian nodded in understanding and nervously followed Wang Jinyuan into the old house. As soon as he entered, he saw a rather beautiful woman sitting on a stone bench in the front hall. One of her arms was lazily propped up on the stone table, and she was watching a man in his 30s write stroke by stroke in boredom. Wang Jinyuan nodded to the nervous Yu Tian, then cupped his hands and said with a smile, "Jinren Lu is really in a good mood." Lu Yi snorted. "Jinren Lu? When did you call me that?" As he spoke, Lu Yi raised his head and glanced at him. It would have been better if he didn't look, but when he did, he was so scared that he shivered. Why was Yu Tian here? Why did Wang Jinyuan bring him back? This bastard, is he trying to frame me? Lu Yi had never expected that Wang Jinyuan would actually bring Yu Tian to him. At this moment, even though Lu Yi was a wily old fox with a profound cultivation base and great mental fortitude, he was still frightened by Yu Tian to the point that he almost revealed a ferocious expression. He unconsciously wanted to smash this person into minced meat with his palm. However, as soon as Lu Yi moved his hand, Wang Jinyuan quietly stood in front of Yu Tian, blocking his line of sight. Wang Jinyuan cupped his hands to Lu Yi with a smile on his face and said, Jinren Lu, you don't have to be so excited to see an old friend, right? You don't know Jinren Yu, do you? Come, let me introduce you. A flash of anger and shock quickly passed through Lu Ye's eyes. He suppressed the anger and shock in his heart and said in a deep voice, well, I was wondering why there was a magpie flying to the branch today. It turns out that a noble has come today. Mei Nyang, who was standing to the side, did not notice the strange situation in front of her at all. She asked curiously, where did the magpie come from? Lu Yi immediately lowered his head and glared at her with an extremely sharp gaze. His voice was very low as he said, go in first and make some tea. Mei Nyang was so frightened by Lu Ye's gaze that she felt as if her heart had been stabbed by a knife. She covered her chest and got up to run into the room. Lu Yi used the action of lowering his head to temporarily vent the anger in his heart. When he raised his head again, his face was full of a gentle smile. Master Wan, can you introduce me to your distinguished guest? Before Wang Jinyuan had time to speak, Yu Tian knelt on the ground with a plop and couldn't help crying out loud. Jinren Lu, Master Wan said that you are chivalrous and have a profound cultivation. You are the current Meng Changjun, the modern bearded man. Please uphold justice for me and avenge me. After that, he kowtowed heavily with his head. He kowtowed like he was pounding garlic, and even the hard bluestone ground was shattered. Lu Yi was a smart person. After hearing these words, he realized the cause of this matter. He quickly glanced at Wang Jinyuan, who was smiling strangely, and took 2 steps forward. He helped him up with a warm expression and said, Jinren Yu, get up quickly. If you have any difficulties, just tell me. If I can help, I will definitely help. Wang Jinyuan also patted the crying Yu Tian and helped him up. After receiving Lu Ye's verbal permission, Yu Tian was relieved. He got up from the ground and carefully sat down next to the stone table. He began to tell the whole story in a low voice. Lu Yi seemed to be listening carefully, but his mind had long flown away. Although Yu Tian had explained it in detail, was there anyone in the world who knew the matter better than him? He had killed them with his own hands, and the whole situation had been set up by him. After listening to Yu Youtian's tearful complaint, Lu Yi sighed and said, don't worry, Jinren Yu. I will definitely seek justice for you. However, it's time to go through the Thunder Retribution. Do you think we can wait until the Thunder Retribution is over before we go to avenge you? Yu Tian was overjoyed and said, Jinren Yu, since you are willing to help me, what else can I ask for? Not to mention waiting for more than 10 days, even if I have to wait for more than 10 years, I am willing. Lu Yi chuckled. At this time, Mei Nyang walked out with 3 cups of tea. Lu Yi pointed at Yu Tian and said to her, Mei Nyang, take him in to rest for a while. Mei Nyang looked at Lu Yi strangely, smiled at Yu Tian and said, please follow me. Yu Tian didn't dare to look at her too much. He was afraid that he would make Lu Yi unhappy and go back on his word. He followed Mei Nyang into this dragon's den and tiger's den. After Yu Tian left, Lu Ye's face slowly darkened. He narrowed his eyes and looked at Wang Jinyuan. Master Wan, you really gave me a big surprise. Wang Jinyuan raised his head and laughed. Jinren Lu, you must be joking. How is this a surprise? The real surprise is yet to come. Aren't you going to deal with Li Yundong? I've given you such a good opportunity. Aren't you going to thank me? Thank you? Lu Yi couldn't help but laugh angrily. It seems that I really should thank you properly. Tell me, how can I thank you? Wang Jinyuan waved his hand with a smile on his face. It seemed that he didn't notice the anger and ridicule in Lu Ye's tone at all. He said with a smile, Jinren Lu, as long as you don't blame me for being nosy. Could it be that you're not worried about the only witness running around outside and causing trouble when the time comes? What could be more reassuring than putting such an important person under your nose? Lu Yi sneered. In his opinion, Wang Jinyuan's action could be said to be killing many birds with one stone. It was both a demonstration of force and a threat to him. Lu Yi thought to himself, this guy, does he think that he can take advantage of me just because he has reached the Jinshin phase? Lu Yi sneered and said, I thought I was cold-blooded and cruel enough. I didn't expect that compared with you, Master Wan. My cultivation is still far inferior. I really admire your ability to teach others to recognize a thief as their father. You must teach me well some other day. How about it? Wang Jinyuan cupped his hands and said with a smile, Jinren Lu, you flatter me. How could I dare to compare myself with you? You can destroy a sect with a flip of your palm. That is an amazing ability. Wang Jinyuan had always been ambitious and was also an ambitious person. Naturally, he was unwilling to be under others for a long time. At this time he had just broken through to the Jinshin phase, so he could no longer bear Lu Ye's orders. However, he didn't dare to confront him openly, so he had an idea and used Yu Tian to test Lu Yi. As long as Lu Yi could tolerate it, it meant that he had tested Lu Ye's new bottom line. If he could tolerate such a thing today, he must be able to tolerate more tomorrow. Seeing that Lu Yi had not done anything, Wang Jinyuan became more confident and proud, and his smile became brighter. Lu Yi looked at his smile and also smiled. The two old foxes looked at each other and laughed, but their eyes were extremely cold. They couldn't wait to kick each other in the face. Humph, sooner or later I will kill you with my own hands. Lu Yi and Wang Jinyuan stared at each other, and the same thought flashed through their minds. Chapter 757. When Yu Tian walked into the trap and danced with the wolf, in Tianan City, Zhou Keqiang was coming out of Li Yunyang's home gloomily. Beside him was his precious daughter, Zhou Qin. It was rare for Zhou Qin not to bicker with her father. She silently accompanied her father downstairs and sent him all the way. This stubborn young lady had a taut face and her mouth was tightly pursed, as if she would laugh if she relaxed a little. Zhou Qin accompanied her father all the way downstairs. After watching him get into the car and leave, she couldn't help but burst into laughter. But as soon as she laughed, Zhou Keqiang's car drove back. He tilted his head from the car, poked out half of his face and said unhappily, "Girls are really outgoing. You speak up for him and even join him to make things difficult for your father. You even make fun of me behind my back. That's outrageous." Zhou Qin immediately straightened her face and said seriously, "As the saying goes, a teacher for a day is a father for a lifetime. What's wrong with me siding with my master?" Zhou Keqiang glared at her and said, "Anyway, keep an eye on your master. Don't let him make trouble again. Why don't you take a look at Desangxian? What are they doing with so many people from Yamaguchi-gumi? If it weren't for me, they and your master would have been arrested long ago." Zhou Qin snorted and said, "Don't take me for a fool. I've talked to these Japanese people. They are all relatively clean. Who would come to China for you to catch?" Zhou Keqiang said angrily, "Anyway, tell him to stop. I just warned you before and you made such a big trouble. If it weren't for the fact that he is so famous now, the higher-ups would have done something to him long ago." Zhou Qin snorted and said, "Well, don't talk nonsense. Aren't you here?" Zhou Keqiang was so angry that his nose was crooked. "I'm a high-ranking official anyway. Do you think I have to do this kind of work for you?" It was rare for Zhou Qin not to bicker with her father. She just waved her hand at him and said, "Well, no matter how high your official position is, you are still a servant of the people. If you don't do this kind of thing, what else can you do? If you don't help us, are you going to help the Japanese?" Zhou Keqiang was so angry that he laughed. He pointed at Zhou Qin and said, "Well, you're good. Good. He patted the driver's seat in front of him and shouted, "Let's go." But after that, before he left, he turned around and smiled at Zhou Qin. "By the way, tell that guy that I'm very happy that he taught the Japanese a lesson, ha." After that, he raised the glass and quickly disappeared from Zhou Qin's sight. Zhou Qin turned around. When she went upstairs, there was still a playful smile on the corner of her mouth, as if she was recalling the conversation between her father and Li Yundong. His father had come this time to tell Li Yundong to keep a low profile. What had Li Yundong said at that time? At that time, Li Yundong said helplessly, "I also want to keep a low profile, but people always come to me to fight. What can I do? We can't just let them hit us on the left side of our faces and let them hit us on the right side, right?" His father was obviously angered by Li Yundong's somewhat shameless words. He chased after him and said, "Li Yundong, as the saying goes, a big hermit hides in the court, a medium hermit hides in the city, and a small hermit hides in the wild. I don't think you're someone who's willing to be alone, so I don't think you're going to hide in the wilderness. But now that you're hiding in the city and causing such a ruckus, let me ask you, do you have any plans to enter the political world?" Hearing this, Zhou Qin knew that her heart was beating faster at that time. Only she knew what her father meant by his words. He wanted to put a curse on Li Yundong, but at the same time he wanted to cultivate him so that in the future, he would owe her a favor and marry her. Zhou Qin grew up in a family of officials. For such a trick, she could clearly figure out the other party's intentions with a little thought. At this time, Zhou Qin walked to the door of the house and stood in front of the door, holding the door handle in one hand and the key in the other. Her eyes were distant, as if she was thinking about the scene just now. If he had agreed at that time, what would have happened? Zhou Qin couldn't help but let her imagination run wild for a moment. She bit her teeth and looked like a little girl with hidden bitterness. But Zhou Qin also knew that Li Yundong would not have agreed. Although he was easygoing and approachable, Zhou Qin knew very well that there was something extremely arrogant in this boy's bones. No one, no force in the world could tame him. He was definitely not a cultivator raised under that kind of system. In fact, Li Yundong refused without any surprise, but his refusal was very clever. It did not hurt Zhou Keqiang's face at all, and it also gave Zhou Qin a good way out. A big hermit hides in the court? Li Yundong suddenly laughed at that time. A talent like me is not suitable to hide in the court. In fact, I am suitable to hide in. Zhou Keqiang's face changed at that time. Do you still want to hide in the wild? Zhou Qin was a very smart woman, so she naturally knew what Zhou Keqiang's subtext was at that time. He had originally wanted to say, do you still want to take my daughter to hide in the wild and take her to suffer like this? But Zhou Keqiang knew that if he said this, his daughter would immediately fall out with him. In fact, at that time, Zhou Qin's face had indeed become very nervous. Like a firebird with its feathers erect, she stared at her father with a warning look in her eyes. Zhou Qin stood at the door in a daze, recalling the scene at that time. She unlocked the door, pushed it open and walked in. After entering the door, she leaned her back against the door and breathed a sigh of relief. Her eyes looked at the ceiling faintly, and the situation at that time unconsciously appeared in her mind. Fortunately, father didn't say this at that time. Otherwise, I really don't know how to behave in front of master. He made it sound like he was threatening him. Zhou Qin thought to herself, but the corners of her mouth unconsciously showed a smile. She smiled and thought to herself, I didn't expect master to still speak the same way as before, even though he has reached such a high cultivation realm. It's really funny. What did Li Yundong say at that time? Ah yes, at that time, Li Yundong looked at his father for a long time, and then suddenly smiled helplessly and said, Governor Zhou, you think too highly of me. Hide in the wild. That's not suitable for me. I was born in the city and you want me to settle down in the mountains. Don't you want my life? How about I hide in bed? What do you think? Hide in bed. What the hell is this? Thinking of this, Zhou Qin couldn't help but burst into laughter again. Her father's expression at that time was really wonderful. His mouth could almost be stuffed with his fist. He definitely couldn't believe that the boy in front of him dared to joke like this. Fortunately, he hadn't said something like, take my daughter to hide in the wild just now. Otherwise, if it became take my daughter to hide in bed, he would really jump off a building and be too ashamed to see anyone. Just as Zhou Qin was leaning against the door and laughing, Li Yundong raised his voice in the room and said, Hey, is your father gone? Please don't laugh. Is it that funny? Zhou Qin suddenly came to her senses and walked to Li Yundong's door with a playful smile on her face. She said softly with a smile, Who told you to say such a thing? What kind of person are you now? How can you say such a thing? Li Yundong spread out his hands and pointed to his bed. Originally they were afraid that I would go out and cause trouble, so I simply cultivated in bed all day long. That was indeed a little secluded in bed. Zhou Qin rolled her eyes and suddenly asked, You mean hiding in bed with Su Chan, right? Li Yundong suddenly coughed dryly and said seriously with a straight face, Why do you sound so strange? Dual cultivation is a very serious matter in cultivation. Hiding in bed with one's Taoist partner is also a joy in the world. Taoist companion? Zhou Qin lowered her head and repeated this sentence to herself several times in a low voice. Suddenly, she raised her head and asked boldly, Master, am I also your Taoist companion? This sentence was too ambiguous. Even Zhou Qin didn't know why she suddenly asked such a question. Perhaps it was because the feelings that had been suppressed for too long had suddenly taken root in the heavy enclosed rock. Perhaps it was because there was no one in the room at this time, which gave Zhou Qin a trace of courage. Perhaps, this was just human nature, the inevitable result of a girl's deep love for another man. But no matter what, as soon as Zhou Qin said this, she regretted it. The proud young lady lowered her noble and elegant swan-like neck. Shyness and chagrin filled her cheeks and neck like the sunset. Out of the unique reserve and self-esteem of a young girl, Zhou Qin wanted to escape from this place immediately, but she seemed to be possessed. Her feet seemed to be rooted to the ground and she didn't move at all. She had been paying attention to the man in front of her out of the corner of her eye, and her heart was beating wildly. Li Yundong was also stunned by Zhou Qin's question. He couldn't help but be stunned for a moment. Many scenes flashed through his mind in an instant. Once, when he was still a young boy and she was still a noble young lady, she had asked him out for the first time in the school pavilion and boldly confessed her love for him. Once, when he had angrily attacked He Xiao and was forced to separate from Su Chan, she had gone to Tibet to cultivate heart. For him, she would rather jump off a building and beg for death than implicate him. Once, she had stubbornly and coldly refused him in the hospital, but in the end she had been amused by him and smiled through her tears, revealing a lovely and pretty look of a little girl. Scenes flashed through Li Yundong's mind like a lantern. He couldn't help but ask himself at a loss, yes, who is Zhou Qin to me? Is she just a disciple? How can I not understand her feelings for me? If she is like this, what about Zi Yuan? Li Yundong's confusion for a moment made Zhou Qin's heart tighten. She felt as if there was an invisible hand in front of her tightly squeezing her heart, forcing her to breathe. Zhou Qin, you be ***, how could you ask such a stupid question? Zhou Qin, who had come to her senses, secretly scolded herself in a low voice. She quickly raised her head and pretended that nothing had happened. She giggled and said, Master, I'm just teasing you. Look at how nervous you are. Li Yundong looked at Zhou Qin with a complicated look in his eyes. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, but Zhou Qin waved her hand and said with an extremely bright smile, It's okay. I'll go back to my room to read the secret method of patching heaven first. Master, you can do your own things. I won't disturb you. After that, she quickly turned around and closed herself in her room, leaving only a young and beautiful but lonely figure for Li Yundong. Li Yundong stood there for a long time and couldn't help but sigh sadly. The world of mortals is full of troubles. When will the world end? I want to go to the 9 realms, but I worry that I have few friends. After Li Yundong casually made up a limerick, he soon smiled self-deprecatingly and said to himself, Damn it, Socrates said that if you marry a gentle and beautiful woman, you will be very happy. If you marry a shrew, you will become a philosopher. If I see Socrates, I will tell him that if you can have 3 beautiful women by your side at the same time, and you are unwilling to give up any of them, then you will become a poet. Chapter 758. Men were always greedy animals. Even a man like Li Yundong, who was loyal to Su Chan, couldn't help but be in a dilemma when faced with the feelings of Zi Yuan and Zhou Qin. He didn't want to hurt these 2 girls who had sacrificed almost everything for him, so he had always avoided facing this problem like an ostrich. But Li Yundong also knew that he would have to face this problem sooner or later and solve it. But Li Yundong also knew that, at least not now. While Li Yundong was alone in a dilemma, Su Chan, Zi Yuan, and Chris were rushing to the United States. In Tiannan University, Yan Hua, the president of the student union. No, it should be said that Yan Fong, she was in even more pain now. In the office of the student union in the office building, many seniors gathered together excitedly, talking about Li Yundong, who had once been an influential figure in the school. But this time there were 2 more people among the people they were talking about, the former president of the student union, Feng Na, and her best friend, Ching Cheng. It was about to be winter vacation, and the leaders of the student union had nothing to do. Most of them were juniors or seniors. Others were busy reviewing their lessons and preparing for the exam, but they were all old foxes. They didn't care about the exam at all. When they had time, they would gather together to spread gossip. Among the many gossips, the gossip about Li Yundong and the others was the most popular. Although Li Yundong had disappeared from their sight, this did not diminish the curiosity of the students in the school. Instead, it made them even more mysterious and admiring. Hey, guess how much Feng Na and Ching Cheng's monthly salary is now? I don't know. I just went to Li Yundong's new tea house 2 days ago. The business is really good. I really can't figure it out. A cup of tea at Desangxian is so expensive that it's almost equivalent to my monthly living expenses, but there are still so many people drinking it. It's unbelievable. No matter how I look at it, the daily turnover of this tea house is at least 6 figures. Tisk, 6 figures? You underestimate Desangxian too much. I heard that a group of Japanese people came out of nowhere and drank all the tea in the tea house a few days ago. It is said that they are still worshipping and burning incense in the tea house. Strange, the Japanese came to the tea house of China to worship and burn incense? Did you take the wrong medicine? Maybe Li Yundong is unconventional? Alas, to be honest, when I went to the opening of the Desangxian tea house with Feng Na and Ching Cheng, I was shocked by so many senior officials. At that time, I felt that Li Yundong was very powerful, but I didn't expect him to be so powerful. He was so influential that the Japanese came to China to support him. This is too exaggerated. Otherwise, why would we say that he is the pride of Tiannan University? Am I right? As the student spoke, he kept winking at Yen Fong, who was not far away, as if he wanted to say something to her. Almost everyone in Tianan University knew that Li Yundong had a grudge with Yen Hua. Li Yundong had helped Feng Na take part in the student council election and eventually defeated Yen Hua to win the championship. This was something that everyone was familiar with. At that time, everyone present thought that if it weren't for Li Yundong, Feng Na wouldn't have been able to beat Yen Huang no matter how many mouths she had. Moreover, when Li Yundong had just opened Desanxian, Yen Hua had once inadvertently said in front of them that Desanxian's business would be bleak and that it would close down in the future. But now it seemed that Yen Hua had really slapped himself in the mouth. Yen Fong naturally knew that these students were saying this to her. She couldn't help but feel more and more irritated. The happiest thing in the world was to hear that one's enemy was living a miserable life. Similarly, the most depressing thing in the world was to hear that one's enemy was doing well, while one's own life was in dire straits. But what made her even more irritated was not the noise of these students. After all, she was a senior cultivator and had once been a master at the top phase of the Yang spirit realm. She was only one step away from the Jinshin. Moreover, in order to take revenge, she had lurked in the Fox Zen school for 9 years. If she had been angry with these students, she would not have been able to live until now. What really made Yen Fong depressed and irritated was that although she had occupied her nephew's body, in her opinion, with her cultivation knowledge and talent, as well as her experience, she would definitely make rapid progress in her cultivation if she occupied such a good man's 7 treasures body furnace. Even if she couldn't break through the Jinshin phase, she would definitely be able to quickly return to the top phase of the Yang spirit realm. Only after losing it would people know how to cherish it. Although the top phase of the Yang spirit realm was not a very great realm in today's cultivation world, Yen Fong herself was not even at the top phase of the Yang spirit realm, which made her suffer every day. She wished she could immediately regain her previous strength. However, when it comes to cultivation, haste makes waste. The more anxious Yen Fong was, the less effective her cultivation would be. On the contrary, her cultivation would continue to decline. What made Yen Fong feel the most pain was that her original primordial Yin Qi and primordial Yang Qi in Yen Hua's body were constantly fighting every day, as if 2 incompatible forces were fighting in her body every day. Most importantly, every time the Yin and Yang Qi in her body fought, she began to have evil thoughts, thinking about those shameful things between men and women. Almost all of her daily cultivation was wasted on controlling these evil thoughts and preventing herself from being possessed by the devil, the internal friction and internal strife. Yen Fong knew that if this went on, it would be very difficult for her to keep her Yin spirit body, let alone restore her cultivation quotient. However, she had no solution to the problem in front of her. How could she not be irritated? At this time, these little kids were ridiculing her. Yen Fong became more and more angry. She turned her face and glared at them fiercely. These college students were just trying to have fun with their mouths. How could they compete with a cultivator like Yen Fong? As soon as she glanced at them, everyone felt their hearts skip a beat, as if they had been burned by an iron brand. They couldn't help but immediately withdraw their gazes and change the topic for a while. After staying in the room for a while, Yen Fong felt that it was so boring that she couldn't stay any longer, so she rushed out anxiously. But when she came outside and was in this quiet and peaceful campus, Yen Fong still couldn't calm her restless and angry heart. Because she had followed Chris and the others to Tiandu Peak, Hardadef had been framed by her. Although Yen Fong had used her Yin spirit to look for Hardadef's body, she couldn't find it no matter how hard she tried. In her anger, she had to make a backup plan. Hardadef was not dead and her identity would be leaked. In panic, the suspicious Yen Fong couldn't trust anyone. She cut off all contact with the cultivation world and waited for the news uneasily. But to her surprise, everything was calm, and there seemed to be nothing unusual around her. Apart from the news that the Desanxian teahouse's business was booming from these so-called classmates, she didn't even know what had happened in the cultivation world. Maybe it's time to go to Desanxian to test it out? Yen Fong took a deep breath and forcibly suppressed the rolling Yuan Yang Qi in her chest. Such a thought came to her mind. But she quickly rejected it, because she knew that if she probed the other party's background with her current cultivation, if she was discovered by the other party, she would be courting death and walking into a trap. At the very least, she had to restore her Yang spirit body, so that even if she couldn't beat them, she could still escape. Thinking of this, Yen Fong couldn't help feeling irritated again. When will I be able to cultivate the Yang spirit body again? I'm afraid it's hopeless in this lifetime, isn't it? Thinking of this, Yen Fong couldn't help but feel a little desperate. She walked around the campus in a daze. After an unknown period of time, she found that she had unknowingly walked back to her home. She subconsciously opened the door, and when she walked into the house, she saw Yan Hua's mother in the living room, watching the smiling, proud wanderer. It was the part where Ren Wuxing and Ling Huchong talked about how he passed the sunflower manual to Dongfang Bubi. When Yan Hua's mother saw Yan Hua coming back, she stood up and said with a smile, "Little Hua, you're back. Do you want me to make you something to eat?" But Yan Huang didn't even look at her. He turned around and went into his room. Yan Hua's mother seemed to have gotten used to Yan Hua's attitude. She sighed softly as if she was afraid of disturbing her child, and turned down the TV volume a lot. But although she had turned down the volume, one of the classic lines still got into Yan Fang's ears. This sentence suddenly made Yan Fang's whole body tremble, and her whole person was stunned. This sentence was like the ringing of a big bell, and it was deafening, buzzing in her mind. This sentence was, "If you want to practice divine skills, castrate yourself with a knife." Some of the descriptions about martial arts and cultivation in Jin Yong's wuxia novels were fabricated, which did not match the actual history. For example, the peak of Chinese martial arts was in the late Qing dynasty and the early Republic of China, not the more ancient, the more powerful mentioned in his book. The world's martial arts did not come from the Shaolin Temple. In addition, Yin Jiping was not a villain who had defiled Xiaolongnu. In real history, Yin Jiping was a great cultivator with extremely high cultivation among the leaders of the Quanzhen sect. But among the many deviations, the seemingly absurd sentence, "If you want to practice divine skills, castrate yourself with a knife," was an extremely classic maxim in the cultivation world. In the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms, Emperor Lu Jixing of the Southern Han dynasty issued the most absurd decree in the 5,000 years of Chinese history. Anyone who wanted to be an official had to be castrated. Even monks and Taoists who wanted to sit and discuss the Tao with him had to be castrated. Although the Southern Han dynasty was peaceful in Guangdong, Guangxi, and a part of Vietnam, it could also be considered one of the longer dynasties among the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms. Unfortunately, the people of this dynasty encountered a great pervert like Lu Jixing. For a time, the entire Southern Han dynasty almost became a castrated country. In order to become an official, many people had no choice but to castrate themselves with a knife. And some Taoist and Buddhist cultivators who wanted to preach the Tao had no choice but to clench their teeth and castrate themselves. But when they castrated themselves, they found that they no longer had the worries of the secular world. It seemed that they had suddenly become pure and desireless, with no desires and no desires. Speaking of which, this was also nonsense. Their balls had been castrated, so what else could they pursue? But the most difficult part of cultivation was to control one's heart. As the saying goes, the old don't practice martial arts, the young don't cultivate the Tao. The muscles and bones of the old had already decayed. If they continued to practice martial arts, they would only be asking for a snub. Meanwhile, the young had vigorous qi and blood. They had nowhere to vent their energy, especially those who were extremely energetic. Aside from women, they never thought of anything else. If these kinds of people cultivated the Tao, it would be strange if they didn't suffer from qi deviation. Although castration was cruel, from a rational point of view, it truly cut off all distracting thoughts and desires. For cultivators, it was truly of great benefit. Lu Jixing's fiendish decree had given rise to a large number of castrated people in southern Han. At the same time, he had also indirectly created a large group of cultivators with profound magical power. This group of self-castrated Taoists and monks, after cultivating without any distracting thoughts, had their cultivation soar by leaps and bounds, attracting the attention of other cultivators. What? You're more formidable than me because you cut off your own balls? Are you kidding me? Fine, I'll do the same if you cut them off. During this period, the castrated sect of the cultivation world flourished. Among them, the most famous was Wang Chongyang's disciple, Taoist master Eternal Spring of the Quanzhen Dragon sect, Qiu Chuji. When Qiu Chuji founded the Dragon's Gate sect, he set down the doctrine of ascetic cultivation, advocating the extermination of desires and emotions. Not only did he set an example by waving his blade and castrating himself, he also did not close his eyes or sleep for 6 years. However, the castrated sect was not mainstream in the cultivation world. Many Taoists still wanted to marry and have children, carrying on the family line. How could they be willing to so easily cut off their own balls? This was especially true towards the end of the Ming and Qing dynasties, when all of Taoism declined, and the Taoist cultivators' desire to save themselves from extinction became the most important matter. Carrying on the family line was the most important task. As a result, Taoists began to cherish their bodies even more, no longer engaging in such castrating activities. It was also precisely because of this that the castrated sect slowly disappeared into the mortal world of history, forgotten by cultivators. Although Yen Fang herself had read a lot of classics, she was also a woman. Although she had occupied the body of her nephew's 7 treasures, the mainstream Taoist ideology of cherishing one's body and cherishing one's life occupied her main thoughts. How could she think of waving a blade and castrating herself? At this time, when she suddenly heard such a sentence, it was like seeing the light in the darkness and feeling the way out in the fog. Yes, I'm tortured to death by this yang qi every day. Why don't I just cut off the root of this yang qi and get it over with once and for all? Yen Fang's heart skipped a beat, and her eyes immediately shot out a determined look. She was a determined and courageous woman. As soon as she thought of this, she found a sharp knife, took off her clothes and bit a towel in her mouth. After preparing the tools to stop the bleeding and disinfecting the knife, Yen Fang gritted her teeth and swung the knife from the pouch under her. Yen Fang's whole body shook violently, and she almost fainted from the pain. Blood kept flowing down her leg. No one knew that with this knife, the first Dongfang booby of modern China was born. The Super 4 group is full. Don't add it. In addition, there was indeed a castrated sect in Taoism, and whether Qiu Chuji was castrated is also controversial. But after looking through the information, I'm inclined to think that he was castrated. Finally, I updated very late. Sorry Tang Tang, I'm tired and went to bed. Good night everyone. Chapter 759. While Yen Fang was castrating herself, Su Chan, Ziyuan, and Chris had already arrived at Harrisburg on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. Compared with other famous large cities in the United States, Harrisburg was much smaller, although it was the capital of a state. Except for Pennsylvania State University, which was known as the most famous university for cultivating entrepreneurs in the country, it could be said that there was almost nothing worth paying attention to in this city. Tens of thousands of people lived in this sparsely populated place. It was like sprinkling a handful of pepper into a pot of soup. Nothing could be seen. Except for people in the community and the main city, there were almost no signs of human habitation in other places. Su Chan and Ziyuan didn't have passports, so it was naturally impossible for them to swagger on the plane with Chris. However, they couldn't fly all the way. After flying for tens of thousands of kilometers, even if they didn't vomit blood, they would be exhausted. Therefore, Su Chan and Ziyuan successfully boarded the plane from Shanghai to Harrisburg under the cover of the goddess Naiyan seal. Harrisburg was not a very famous place. There were not many people going there and there were few flights. There were many empty seats on the plane. After Su Chan and Ziyuan got on the plane, they found a place at random and sat down peacefully. They either meditated or closed their eyes to sleep. Anyway, the plane had taken off, and there was no such thing as passengers getting on halfway, so they didn't have to worry about being discovered. After the 3 of them got off the plane, Chris stopped a taxi. Instead of going home, she went straight to Harrisburg Hospital. This hospital was equivalent to a city hospital in China. It had 400 beds and was a first-class hospital with complete facilities. Chris was worried about the safety of her grandmother. Along the way, she didn't have time to introduce the customs of Harrisburg to Su Chan and Ziyuan. She just looked out of the window, anxious to go home. Su Chan looked out of the window curiously. The scenery outside was in sharp contrast to the scenery of China, which was full of people and buildings. The first thing she saw was the extremely wide grass, as if she was in a grassland. After the taxi drove for a long time, they slowly entered the city. There were gradually more buildings around them, but there were not many tall buildings, which was very different from what Su Chan had expected. The driver was a black man. Along the way, he kept sneaking glances at Ziyuan and Su Chan through the rearview mirror. These 2 beautiful women from the east had different appearances, but they were both stunning beauties, which really amazed him. The black man was talkative. Along the way, he tried to strike up a conversation with Su Chan and Ziyuan several times, but the 2 of them didn't understand English and didn't want to show their timidity outside, so they turned their heads and looked out of the window, as if they didn't want strangers to come in. The black man had failed to strike up a conversation with Su Chan, so he had no choice but to settle for the next best thing. He turned his head and tried to strike up a conversation with Chris. Annoyed, Chris couldn't help but yell at him. Only then did the black man obediently start driving his car. However, it didn't take long for him to start playing black blues music again. He was humming unconsciously, which really annoyed Su Chan and the others. On the wide and empty asphalt road of Harrisburg, a taxi was driving fast, and from time to time, a burst of fast-paced rap music came from the window. They drove all the way to Harrisburg Hospital. Su Chan and the others ran out of the car as if they were fleeing for their lives. Su Chan patted her chest and said to Ziyuan with a wry smile, "Sister Ziyuan, this foreigner is too talkative, isn't he? He didn't stop talking all the way. I really want to poke his acupoints." Ziyuan smiled and said, "I want to too, but I can only think about it. This is not like our country. A little trouble here can lead to big trouble." Su Chan nodded and looked around carefully. At this time, after Chris had paid the bill, she came to their side, patted Su Chan's arm and said, "Come, you guys come with me over here." Su Chan and Ziyuan followed Chris into Harrisburg Hospital. After entering the inpatient building, Chris asked the nurse on duty and went straight to her grandmother's care ward. Chris's family was considered a famous family in the local area, so Lin Guiying lived in a special care ward. It was a single room, spacious and bright, with a special senior nurse in charge of taking care of her. As soon as Chris entered the door, she saw a young woman and a well-dressed man sitting by Lin Guiying's bed. This young woman was Chris's biological sister, Kurt, and the man next to her was her husband. Kurt immediately stood up when he saw Chris. With a look of surprise on his face, he walked over to her, opened his arms and hugged her tightly. "Oh, Chris, baby, I thought I would never see you again. Jim said that you were far away in China and didn't want to come back." Chris patted her on the back and kissed her on the cheek. Then she hugged Kurt's husband and said in a low voice, "How is Grandma? Hasn't she always been in good health? Why did she suddenly?" As she spoke, Chris looked over and saw that Lin Guiying, who used to be able to jump on plum stacks as tall as a man, was now lying quietly on the hospital bed. There was a breathing tube connected to a ventilator in her mouth, and a nasal feeding tube connected to her nose to deliver liquid food. Her eyes were closed and her body was motionless. Her skin showed an extremely unhealthy paleness. If it weren't for the electrocardiogram monitor next to her showing a trace of life, Chris would have thought that Lin Guiying had died. Seeing her dearest grandmother like this, Chris's eyes were suddenly filled with tears. Kurt, who was at the side, sighed softly and said, "A few days ago when Granny was practicing her martial arts on a wooden pole, she probably fell from it. When the servants found her, she had already been unconscious for a few hours. When she was sent to the hospital, the doctor said that it was a sudden cerebral thrombosis that caused her paralysis. Now she is in a vegetative state and I don't know if she will wake up." Kurt had been studying abroad since he was a child, so he didn't have any deep feelings for Lin Guiying. However, Lin Guiying had a high status in the family. As a junior, he naturally had to come back to check on her. After explaining the situation in a low voice, she looked at Ziyuan and Su Chan and motioned for Chris to introduce them. "Chris, who are these two?" Chris wiped away her tears and forced herself to calm down. "Sister, these are my two good friends in China. Her name is Su Chan and her name is Ziyuan." As she spoke, she introduced Kurt and her husband to Su Chan and Ziyuan. After shaking hands politely and reservedly according to etiquette, Ziyuan's eyes couldn't help but fall on Lin Guiying. After looking at her carefully for a while, she suddenly frowned and reached out to touch Lin Guiying's wrist. Kurt's husband shouted subconsciously, trying to stop Ziyuan. "Hey, be careful. She's a seriously ill patient in front of you." Ziyuan didn't understand what he was saying, so she just glanced at him faintly. This glance stunned Kurt's husband, and he almost lost his composure on the spot because of Ziyuan's amazing appearance. When he came to his senses, he shrugged his shoulders awkwardly, indicating that he would not stop her. Kurt saw Ziyuan press Lin Guiying's pulse with her hand, then explore her neck and heart. She couldn't help but pull Chris aside and whisper, "Chris, who are they? What are they doing here?" Chris's eyes were full of hope as she stared at Ziyuan, as if she was eager to see a trace of good news from Ziyuan's face in the next second. She said casually, "They are all very powerful doctors. Well, they can also be considered doctors." Kurt slapped her forehead. "Damn it, what do you mean by they can also be considered doctors? Hey Chris, I know that you have been very obsessed with China since you were a child, but you don't have to provoke the Chinese for such a thing, do you?" The beauty of Su Chan and Ziyuan was extremely amazing, transcending any racial prejudice and national boundaries. Even the strongest racist would be shocked by their amazing beauty when they saw Ziyuan and Su Chan. Kurt was naturally aware of her husband's absent-minded state. She herself could be considered a beautiful woman. Suddenly seeing her husband fall head over heels in love with these two peerless beauties, she was naturally extremely displeased, and a great sense of disgust arose in her heart. Chris was worried about the safety of her grandmother, so she didn't pay much attention to her sister's thoughts. She said casually, "It's okay. Let them see. There can't be a worse situation than this. They should have a way. Kurt knew that although her sister was younger than her, she was determined and very strong-willed. It was difficult for anyone to change her mind once she decided on something. She was unhappy and muttered in a low voice, "Humph, these ignorant Chinese people know nothing but selling fake goods and playing kung fu." Chris glanced at her quickly. She was not in the mood to argue with her sister here. She walked over to Ziyuan and asked in a low voice, "Ziyuan, how is my grandmother?" Ziyuan withdrew her hand and looked at Chris. She quickly glanced at Kurt and her husband with some scruples. Chris knew what she meant and quickly said in Chinese, "It's okay. They don't understand Chinese. Just tell me directly." Ziyuan nodded. "Chris, I have good news and bad news as well as good news that is neither good nor bad. Which one do you want to hear first?" Chris said without hesitation, "Listen to the good news first." Ziyuan smiled slightly. "The good news is, your grandmother didn't have a cerebral thrombosis. It's just that the symptoms are very similar." Chris beamed with joy. "Yes, my grandmother is in good health. She was practicing boxing before the disease broke out. My sister said that she fell from the plum blossom stump." Plum blossom stump? Ziyuan looked at Lin Guiying, who was lying in the hospital bed, and said, "It turns out that she practiced plum blossom boxing. No wonder your grandmother is so old, but her internal organs are very healthy and strong. Among the elderly she is very good." Chris took a deep breath and said, "Well, I've heard the good news. It's time to tell the bad news." Seeing that she was like an uneasy prisoner waiting to be sentenced, Ziyuan couldn't help but smile and comfort her. "Don't be so nervous. It's not that bad. The bad news is that your grandmother isn't sick, but she's been cursed by someone." "Ah?" Chris and Su-chan were shocked at the same time. Su-chan hurriedly rushed to Lin Guiying's side, opened her eyelids to take a look, and then reached out to test her meridians. Kurt frowned and wanted to interrupt them, but he couldn't because of Chris. He could only stare at Ziyuan and Su-chan sullenly. Su-chan took a quick look and returned to Ziyuan's side in surprise. She said to Chris, "It's the soul-stealing spell. This is a Taoist magic. Did your grandmother offend some cultivators?" Chris looked confused. "No, my grandmother lives in seclusion and has always been kind to others. How could she have offended anyone?" Ziyuan shook her head slightly. "Now let me tell you the good news. The soul-detaching spell that your grandma was afflicted with was very powerful, and only masters could cast it. This was bad news, but the good news was that to maintain the spell one could not be too far away. In other words, the furthest she could go was near Harrisburg. Moreover, your grandmother is still alive, which means that the person who used it is still in Harrisburg." Chris was confused. She really couldn't understand why such a thing would happen in the distant United States. Who on earth was this Taoist cultivator of unknown origin? Why did he attack her grandmother? Chapter 760. Chris looked puzzled and couldn't help asking Ziyuan, "What kind of magic is this soul-stealing spell?" Ziyuan pulled Chris's arm and motioned for her to walk over to Lin Guiying. She said softly, "In the eyes of Taoist cultivators, people have 3 souls and 7 spirits. The 3 souls are the heaven soul, the earth soul, and the life soul, also known as the embryo light, the refreshing spirit, and the nether spirit. The 7 spirits are Tianchong, Linghui, Central Center, Qi, Li Jing, and Ying, also known as the devouring thief, the dead dog, the eliminating filth, the smelly lung, the sparrow Yin, the non-poison, and the hidden arrow." As she spoke, Ziyuan pointed to Lin Guiying and said, "Your grandmother only has the life soul of the 3 souls left, which is the refreshing spirit, which is in charge of the 5 elements. Of the 7 spirits, only one is left, which is the eliminating filth spirit, which maintains the metabolism of the human body. The other 6 spirits have been dispersed and are nowhere to be found." Chris said anxiously, "Then how can I save my grandmother? Do I have to find the caster? Do I need to kill him?" Ziyuan shook her head and said, "If it's just witchcraft, killing the caster will naturally remove the magic, but our Taoist magic is not like this. Although this magic needs to be maintained, the reason why it needs to be maintained is that it has to be controlled all the time so that the victim's 3 souls and 7 spirits will not scatter between heaven and earth and can no longer be summoned back. Most of the people who can use this magic are masters. And if this person really has a grudge against your grandmother, he can completely shatter your grandmother's 3 souls and 7 spirits at once. He doesn't have to make your grandmother into a vegetable like she is now, neither dead nor alive." Chris was also an extremely smart person. Her eyes lit up and she said, "You mean, this person doesn't want my grandmother's life?" Ziyuan nodded slightly. Yes, if I'm not mistaken, this person should want to use your grandmother to threaten you or your family. Su Chan suddenly said, it's also possible that he wants to take this opportunity to get close to you. For example, he pretended to cast a spell on your grandmother and then helped her remove it so that you would be grateful and trust him. When Chris heard this, her heart couldn't help but tremble. Her face was gloomy and uncertain. She gritted her teeth and said in a low voice, what you said makes sense. It's very likely. However, which cultivator would want to do this to me or our family? We didn't offend them. Su Chan looked at her worriedly, then turned to Ziyuan and said, Sister Ziyuan, do you know any powerful cultivators and cultivation sects abroad? Ziyuan shook her head and said, I don't know. There was a trace of connection between the domestic cultivation world and the foreign cultivation world 30 or 40 years ago, but slowly the connection between the two became less and less. Gradually they became two schools of thought. They both said that they were the right way and accused each other of being the worst. No one was convinced by the other. Even the foreign cultivation world shouted that the masters were abroad, and they sneered at the domestic cultivators and disdained them. Su Chan also nodded slightly and said, yes, I saw the internal conflict between the Shintian sect and the Jingyi school a while ago. At that time, I also felt that the Shintian sect was very powerful and seemed to have many masters. By the way, Sister Ziyuan, do you think it could be the Shintian sect? Ziyuan thought for a moment and said, I don't know, but it shouldn't be. The two of them were talking in low voices. Kurt's eyes were wide open and she was confused. She didn't know what they were talking about. She grabbed Chris and said unhappily, Chris, what are you talking about with your Chinese friends? Chris hesitated for a moment, but she still didn't tell her sister the news. Her mind raced and she soon came up with an idea. They said that Grandma's disease is incurable, and they can't do anything about it. Kurt snorted. That's obvious. It would be strange if they could cure Grandma. Chris thought for a moment and said, Sister, I want to hold a banquet in the name of praying for Grandma. What do you think? By the way, I want to contact everyone and see if they have any good ideas. It's also good to brainstorm. Kurt hesitated for a moment. A banquet? She looked at the unconscious Lin Guiying and said, it's not good for Grandma to be like this, is it? Chris said, that's why it's being held in the name of praying for blessings. Why don't you inform our relatives and friends, and then inform other people in the nearby community? What do you think? While Kurt was still hesitating, her husband suddenly had an idea. He thought that since there was going to be a banquet, maybe Chris's two beautiful Chinese girls would also attend. At that time he would have a chance to get to know them. As soon as this idea came to his mind, Kurt's husband said, Kurt, that's a good idea. Kurt didn't know what her husband was thinking. After being persuaded, she didn't insist. She just said, I have to go back and listen to my father and mother's opinions. Then she picked up her cell phone and dialed a number. Chris didn't comment. In her opinion, even if her father and mother didn't agree, she would hold the banquet in her own name. After Kurt walked aside to make the call, she walked back and smiled at Chris. Chris, my father and mother have agreed. Chris smiled, turned to Ziyuan and Su Chan and said in Chinese, now it's all right. I've held a banquet. If someone is really plotting against me behind my back, he will definitely come to my banquet and jump out in a hurry. Ziyuan nodded approvingly and said, that's a good idea. It's a good method. Su Chan also said with a smile, this person definitely won't expect us to be standing behind you. The three of them smiled at each other as if they could already see the shock and surprise on the other party's face after their scheme had been exposed. However, Su Chan and Ziyuan had never expected who was standing behind this mastermind. Westerners had a strong sense of independence. Many of them would choose to move out as soon as they had the financial ability after they reached adulthood. Chris was the same. Although she often went to Lin Guiying's house in the garden to have fun, her own house was in a spacious green lawn not far away. Chris had a small 3-story villa. Compared with ordinary people's wooden houses that could be dismantled and transported, the villa she lived in was made of stone. The front yard was a wide and flat lawn, and there was a circle of flowers in the middle of the lawn. A middle-aged Asian woman was kneeling beside the flower bed through a cloth towel, carefully trimming and arranging the flowers. When Chris returned to her home with Ziyuan and Su Chan, she first greeted the Asian woman. Wang, I'm back. The Asian woman turned around and looked at Chris in surprise, saying, Chris, why are you back? I heard from Jim that you weren't coming back. Chris forced a smile. Grandma is sick. Of course, I have to come back to see her. There were almost no tall buildings in the community in the United States, and the neighbors were very close to each other, completely unlike the modern cities in China, where the neighbors never contacted each other. As soon as Chris's voice sounded, the surrounding neighbors rushed out one after another and greeted Chris warmly. At the same time they looked at Su Chan and Ziyuan curiously. After Chris responded to them one by one, she took Su Chan and Ziyuan into her home. At this time, in a villa not far from Chris, Han Jin slowly put down the curtain in front of him and smiled coldly. In order to pursue Chris, he had specially bought this villa here at a high price, just to get close to her first. Now that he saw that Chris had finally returned as he had wished, he was so proud that he wanted to rush out and greet her immediately, but he held back and thought proudly, "Don't worry, Chris. It's not the best time to greet you yet. When I appear in front of you again, you will cry and beg me to save your grandma." Han Jin looked back proudly and said respectfully, "Master, what should we do next?" The person standing in front of Han Jin was none other than Su Ling, a Jinshin master who had once shown off his power on Tiandu Peak. Standing next to him was the blind Taoist priest, Su Kong, who had stabbed his eyes in order to save his Shixiang. Su Ling sat on the sofa, waved his hand and said with a big smile, "You designed the plan yourself. Why are you asking me? I only care about casting magic. I don't care about anything else." As he said this, his eyes narrowed and he said coldly, "I told you in advance that the donation you promised can't be less than a penny." After the Battle of Tiandu Peak that day, Su Ling and Su Kong were defeated by the heavenly thunder of the Thunder Retribution Master. The two of them also knew that the Battle of Tiandu Peak had offended all the major sects in the Chinese cultivation world, so they did not dare to stay on the mainland any longer. In a flash they ran to Southeast Asia to hide. On the one hand they could find the power of Zenkingism in Southeast Asia, so that it would be convenient for them to seize power in the future. On the other hand they could also recuperate from their injuries and plot again. Although Su Ling and Su Kong were pleasantly surprised to find that Zenkingism still had power in Southeast Asia, and it was quite powerful, when they went to look for them they soon couldn't laugh anymore. Su Ling was domineering and overbearing, so naturally, his attitude would not be very good when he went to look for them. In addition, in his opinion, when a senior like him came, the younger generation should hurry out to welcome him. But the truth was completely the opposite. In the eyes of the followers of Zenkingism in Southeast Asia, regardless of whether the identities of Su Ling and Su Kong were true or not, they would never tolerate a person who had suddenly appeared and tried to stand on their heads. Even if this person was their senior, they would still slap him down. As the saying goes, the new waves of the Yangtze River push the old waves, and the old waves die on the beach. Why didn't they stay on the beach? Why did they come to Southeast Asia? Did they want to die? Su Ling was arrogant and bad-tempered. On the other side he was also suspicious. In such a situation, it was naturally impossible for them to talk together. After a few words the two sides started fighting. Su Ling's own injuries had not healed, and he and his junior brother were beaten until they covered their heads and fled. In the end, they ran around and finally exiled to a place called Harrisburg on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. These two guys, whose thinking was still stuck in the chaotic period of the Republic of China, thought that with their own strength on this land, it would be a matter of minutes if they wanted to fight for a territory. Therefore they showed the banner of Zenkingism and looked for the local gangs to fight. However, the gang that Su Ling and Su Kong chose was the Han family. At this time Han Jin came back from China. When he heard that these two Taoist priests dared to cause trouble, he immediately picked a dozen people with all kinds of guns to cause trouble for Su Ling and Su Kong. Su Ling and Su Kong were also very straightforward. They started a big fight with Han Jin's people. Needless to say, although Han Jin had guns in his hand, he was naturally defeated when he met a Jinshin master and a Yang spirit master. However, Su Ling and Su Kong also knew what was important and did not kill them. They only forced Han Jin to give up his territory or pay a membership fee. Han Jin was depressed and wronged. When a gangster met someone who was even more evil than him, he had no way to reason with them. However, he also reacted very quickly. He immediately bowed to Su Ling and shamelessly took him as his master. Su Ling was addicted to accepting disciples, so he naturally waved his hand and happily accepted him. It was also because he had seen Su Ling's remarkable ability that Han Jin had an idea. That was why Lin Guiying was seriously ill, and Chris was eager to return home. Hearing what Su Ling said to him, Han Jin said respectfully, "Master, don't worry. When the time comes, not only will I not give you a penny less, but I may even earn you another believer. For example, a family that controls the light industry in Harrisburg. What do you think?" When Su Ling heard this, he was overjoyed. He looked at his disciple, who was smiling, and laughed. The two of them had ulterior motives. They felt that they were the mantis stalking the cicada, unaware of the aureole behind it. Ziyuan and Su Chan, who lived opposite them, also wanted to be the mantis stalking the cicada. However, neither of them knew that this time, the few people who had fought fiercely on Tiandu Peak had gone around the earth and bumped into each other again. It suddenly occurred to me that recently, the online literature world had been cracking down on transmigration. The reason was that there was a child who wanted to commit suicide in the novel. As a result, he wanted to transmigrate, so he committed suicide. Well, in view of the chapter about wanting to practice the divine kung fu and castrating himself with a knife, I have to say, children should not learn it. You don't want to see this book be harmonized, do you? Chapter 761. The banquet that Chris held at her home kicked off the next evening. It was a banquet for more than 100 people. Since the community had a business organization that was responsible for hosting banquets and a housekeeper was in charge of organizing it, Chris didn't have to worry too much. All she had to do was take care of herself. In order to avoid missing out on the mastermind behind the scenes, Chris invited almost everyone who was related to her to the banquet. She even invited some of her classmates from school, including Han Zhen. When Han Zhen received Chris's invitation letter, he was so excited that he almost jumped up. It was as if he could already see a snow-white lamb walking step by step into his trap. That night he deliberately dressed up very well. He was dressed in a suit and leather shoes. The leather shoes on his feet shone brightly, and his hair was combed back as if it had been plowed. Han Jin raised a goblet with a smile on his face. He looked at Chris, who was chatting with the crowd. His eyes were as sharp as a beast staring at its prey. Chris was wearing a plain white slanted dress that revealed half of her smooth shoulders and the snow-white skin on her chest. Because her grandmother was hospitalized, she had specially pinned a black flower on her shoulder, which made her look solemn, noble, and elegant. The guests also knew about Chris's situation. Many of them came up to her to comfort her and pray at the Christ statue in the middle of the hall. Chris's parents were devout Christians, but Chris herself was not. She was deeply influenced by Lin Guiying and did not believe in Christianity. However, only a few people in the family knew this. In their eyes, if the parents were Christians, how could the child not be? But Chris was not. It was precisely because of this that when she held this banquet, no one noticed anything wrong. Han Jin stared at Chris for a long time. When he saw that Chris had finished dealing with the last customer, she leaned against the table and sighed softly. Her expression was full of exhaustion. Han Jin knew that this was the best time for him to appear. "Hi Chris, you're finally back. I thought you wouldn't come back." Han Jin stepped forward with a glass of wine in his hand. With a sincere look on his face, he greeted them enthusiastically in fluent English. On one hand, Chris had to deal with so many people on the scene, and on the other hand, she had to constantly observe their expressions and movements to figure out which one was the mastermind behind the scourge of her grandmother. It seems simple, but in fact it took a lot of effort. Why did most cultivators keep a low profile and live in seclusion? The reason was that they were unwilling to deal with things like dealing with people. The most tiring and annoying thing in the world was dealing with people, not to mention scheming and guessing at people's hearts. Because of this, each sect in the cultivation world often had a person who had a strong voice. This person was responsible for almost all the external affairs of the sect. It could be said that he was the diplomat of the sect, such as Zhang Ling of the Jingyi school, Du Fei of the Chuanjin Dragon sect, and Wan Jinyuan of the Gizao sect. In these sects, there were many people with higher cultivation levels than them, but when it came to speaking to the outside world, they were the ones who stood up to speak. It was not only because of their personalities and their innate ability to deal with people, but also because the higher the cultivation level of a cultivator, the more they liked to hide. They did not like to come into contact with complicated things and complicated human nature. Whether it was Zhang Ling, Du Fei, or Wan Jinyuan, they all had one most obvious characteristic. Their cultivation levels were not high. This was because a large part of their energy was wasted on dealing with people. Chris had received dozens of people in a row. It was as if she had fought with people several times in a row. She was so tired that she almost wanted to lie in bed and not move. But when she saw Han Zhen coming over at this time, she had to brace herself and deal with him. Han Zhen was of medium height, handsome and gentle. He was dressed in expensive clothes and wore a pair of black-rimmed glasses on his face, which perfectly set off his dignified, noble and restrained temperament. In terms of appearance alone, Han Zhen was not inferior to any movie star. Although he was Asian, his rich family background and handsome appearance made him have many suitors at Pennsylvania State University. Unfortunately, Chris knew Han Zhen very well. She knew that this man had a shrewdness that did not match his age. He would do anything to achieve his goals. He was a man who had no bottom line or morality at all. It was because she had long seen through this that Chris had always kept a respectful distance from Han Zhen's pursuit. Many girls who pursued Han Zhen but failed became more and more jealous of Chris because of this, thinking that she was a whore who only knew how to pretend to be virtuous. But only Chris knew that when she observed Han Zhen up close, she could see a deeply hidden possessiveness in the man's eyes. And today, the strange light in Han Zhen's eyes made Chris feel particularly vigilant. Chris forced a smile and said in fluent Chinese, "The weather is unpredictable and people have their ups and downs. How can I decide whether I come back or not?" Seeing that she was speaking to him in Chinese, Han Zhen had no choice but to say in not very fluent Chinese, "I remember there is a saying, the moon has its ups and downs." What? How can this saying be used? Chris smiled slightly and said, "The moon has its ups and downs and people have their sorrows and joys and sorrows and reunions." This is Su Dongpa's Shuidiao Getu, one of my favorite poems. Han Zhen couldn't help but compliment her. "Chris, your Chinese is so good. You really make me feel ashamed." "My Chinese is so good?" Chris muttered in her heart, and her expression became a little strange. She couldn't help but think of Li Yundong's evaluation of her. "Your Chinese is at most at the level of a 5th or 6th grader in primary school. If you can cultivate to the primary level of the Jinshin, it will be the limit because you don't understand the real traditional culture of China. You don't know what the unity of heaven and man is, and what the infinite void is. My level of a 5th or 6th grader in primary school is really good. Then what level is this Han Zhen?" For a moment, Chris felt that it was very absurd. She, a blonde foreign girl, had been sincerely praised by this black-haired, black-eyed Chinese man in front of her for her excellent Chinese, and he, a Chinese man of pure Chinese descent, couldn't even finish a Shuidiao Getu. On the other hand, she, a foreign devil who had been criticized by Li Yundong as being at the level of a primary school student, had continued. This was really an ironic scene full of black humor. Han Zhen saw that Chris's smile was a little strange and her eyes were flickering, as if she was thinking about something, but he didn't think too much about it. He didn't believe that this prey could jump out of his palm. He smiled and said, "Chris, don't worry about your grandmother. I believe that after the worst comes the best, your grandmother will get better." At this time, Chris also came to her senses. She smiled slightly, raised her glass to Han Zhen and said, "Thank you for your kindness. Cheers." After they clinked their glasses and took a sip, Chris suddenly asked, "By the way, Han Zhen, do you know any good way to save my grandmother? You know, the best doctors in Pennsylvania have been invited, but they are all at a loss. Maybe you have a good doctor that you can recommend to me?" Chris had said this to almost everyone before, and the guests she had invited naturally knew the purpose of Chris's banquet, so they had done their homework early. Chris had received a thick stack of business cards. However, most of the business cards were famous doctors from famous cities such as New York, Washington, and Los Angeles, but there was no answer that Chris was looking for. But when she said these words to Han Zhen mechanically, Han Zhen couldn't help but be ecstatic. "Wow, I was just worried about how to say it and you actually came to me. Then I won't stand on ceremony." The strange look in Han Zhen's eyes made the tired Chris immediately put up her guard. Her heart suddenly skipped a beat, and she stared at Han Zhen as if she had noticed something. In fact, Chris had listed Han Zhen as the most suspicious target at first, but then she thought about it and felt that although Han Zhen had a bad character, there was no doubt that he was smart and cunning. He would not do such a thing at such a critical juncture. Once she found out, her disgust for him would definitely escalate to hatred. It was impossible for him not to have thought of this. However, Chris had not expected that Han Zhen would actually run into Su Ling and Su Ku. Moreover, Han Zhen had only known that Chris had gone to China, but he did not know that Chris had gone to China to study cultivation. Therefore, when he had run into a cultivator, he had thought that he was the only lucky person in the world who knew about such a powerful character. Therefore, Han Zhen had only covered up this matter a little at the beginning, but then he had swaggered out and stood up without any scruples. One was a little presumptuous while the other was self-righteous. The two sides had accidentally come together, resulting in the current situation. The most suspicious person had been let go by Chris, but in the end, after a round of investigation, the suspect had still fallen on this guy. Han Zhen pretended to be hesitant and said, "Chris, I do have a way, but..." Seeing his abnormality, Chris became more and more vigilant in her heart, but she did not show it on her face. Instead, she asked anxiously, "But what?" Han Zhen looked around and said in a low voice, pretending to be mysterious, "I know a very powerful Taoist priest. He should be able to cure your grandmother's illness." Are you interested in meeting him? It really was him. Hearing this, Chris was shocked. She immediately clenched the wine glass in her hand so hard that she almost crushed it in an instant. However, she came from a famous family and was very shrewd. She forcibly suppressed the anger in her heart and showed a puzzled expression on her face. A Taoist priest? A Taoist priest can cure diseases? Seeing Chris's expression, Han Zhen was not surprised but happy. He said with a smile, I knew you would react like this. When I first saw this Taoist priest, I had the same thought as you. Hey Chris, although you know China well, you probably don't know how many magical powers these Taoist priests have, do you? Chris sneered in her heart and thought to herself, if I tell you about the fighting methods I've seen in China, you will be scared to death. However, she deliberately said disapprovingly, is that so? Han Zhen waved his hand and said mysteriously, Chris, if you don't believe me, come with me to see it. How about it? It's at my house. It's not far from here. Chris hesitated for a moment and quickly glanced upstairs. She saw Ziyuan, who was secretly looking at her through the gap of a half-hidden door upstairs, nodding gently at her. Chris immediately made up her mind and said to Han Zhen, okay, take me to see it. Han Zhen was overjoyed and said with a smile, you definitely won't be disappointed. Chris sneered in her heart, but she forced a smile on her face. I hope so. After saying goodbye to some of the acquaintances at the banquet, they went to Han Zhen's house. Their houses were quite close, so it would only take them 2 or 3 minutes to get there. At this time, Su Chan and Ziyuan, who had been hiding in the dark and watching Chris, looked at each other and followed her from a distance. The two of them knew that Chris must have found the real mastermind at this time. They didn't know who this mastermind was, what his identity was, or what his strength was. Therefore, they were more vigilant and carefully restrained their auras. Under the cover of the goddess Nyan seal, they followed Chris and sneaked into Han Zhen's house. After entering Han Zhen's house, Su Chan and Ziyuan saw a man in a Taoist robe with his hair combed into a high bun, with his back to them. Su Chan immediately tugged at Ziyuan's sleeve and asked her with her eyes as if to say, Sister Ziyuan, this is the person, right? When Ziyuan saw the figure of this person, she vaguely felt that he was a little familiar, but she was not sure. She secretly transmitted a voice message, it should be him. Be careful. At this time, the Taoist seemed to have noticed that Chris and Han Zhen had returned. He turned around and laughed. Good disciple, you're back? As soon as the man turned around, Chris was so scared that her legs trembled. She subconsciously wanted to turn around and run. She had a deep impression of this person. This was the devil-like Su Ling who had killed everyone on Tiandu Peak. Even Li Yundong, Ziyuan, Zhou Qin, and Su Chan couldn't do anything to him. When Ziyuan and Su Chan saw him, they were so scared that their hearts almost jumped out of their chests. They thought in their minds at the same time, isn't the earth too small? There will be another chapter in a while. It will probably be around 12:30 p.m. Those who can't wait can go to sleep first. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.